a policy to readmit undesirable people living on the French soil. I would put in place the reverse policy chronologically and from a methodology point of view, but with the same purpose, to hold friendly relationships with Algeria and accounting for the observations of the ambassador in his last book, who explained that Algerians understand and know French people very well, despite the fact that French people who think that they know Algeria have a skewed vision of what is happening and don't really understand anything about it. I'm not forgetting the observation under which Marseille is closer geographically to Paris and would not be part of the debate that consists in determining whether the Mediterranean should be perceived as a border between Europe and Africa or a lake around which would be encouraged a civilization that aims at unity. Vis-à-vis Algeria, my hope, therefore, is from the beginning to set as a condition all handing out of visas to Algerian citizens, all transfer of funds, to all acquisition of own property in France by dignitaries from Algeria with different elements, and an effective putting in place of the readmission by the consular authorities in France, Algerian consular authorities in France. I think we need to start this right from the beginning, which none of my predecessors dared to do, and then to little by little build relationships between sovereign states from one to another, which seems to be more in the interest of Algeria and Algerians than it is in the interest of France. In the end, we are not dependent economically on Algeria, nor on gas from Algeria. It is mainly in the interest of Algeria that its relationships with France be healthy and appeased. I will repeat this, and without forgetting anything that happened in the past, because recognition of the past, of the glorious elements and the shadows, does not mean that repentance. I would like to develop friendly relationships with the Algerian people because it's in our mutual interest and because it is a question, in the end, that is more sentimental on either side rather than rational or economically essential and indispensable for France. The Algerians who already live in France and behave according to French law, respect our uses and customs, like France, its tradition, history, culture, who benefit from work contracts and enrich us with their know-how, which constitutes, of course, most of them, I believe, do not have any reason to not be invited to remain here. The others, in a minority, of course, will have to leave. And consular services in Algeria will have to deliver laissez-passer certificates to respect the sovereign decision of France and remove from its soil any foreigner that they deem to be undesirable, without criminal sentencing. Once elected, I will have an open stance with Algeria, and I think that our two countries have everything to win from it. I wish to adopt a policy that is comparable with, for example, the Comores. Let me move from the shores of the Mediterranean to the Rhine and Elbe. I would like to, in respect with Germany, dissipate any misunderstanding. If I have been able to rightly criticize strongly Mrs. Angela Merkel because the energy and migratory policies, but also the discreet and careful hegemony in Europe was actually negative for Europe and for her own country, I would like to say that I do not nourish any hostility against the German nation. I am aware as much about the economic interdependence between France and Germany and the cultural influences and mutual civilization influences that we are not aware enough of in France, and that it was deemed to be necessary to remove from the history books in France after 1870. The fact, for example, that France have the Confederation of the Rhine, where France started unifying Germany even before Bismarck. Traditions in foreign policy in France and Germany differ often, and often Germans perceive France as too Jacobite, whereas French people do not understand that well German federalism. I do not believe that they are incompatible. If we are not seeking to set, without saying so, the German model on France via the Europe of regions or the building of great or major transporter regions, each nation has its own genius, its political traditions and its territorial organization. And I will, as General Adenauer and de Gaulle said, and then Valéry Giscard and Helmut Schmidt, that we are forging reconciliation between Germany and France without following, of course, the Macron-Merkel blindness of France as regards Berlin. It is normal that Berlin defends its interests, that we defend our own interests, which is what President Macron did insufficiently well, and France and Germany, not exclusively, work towards the interests of the continent. I will not let Germany destroy the French nuclear industry, for example, and I will try to ensure that I can convince German partners, as the gas crisis shows, of the good model that we have in France, based mainly on nuclear power and hydroelectric power. This does not, of course, push out the cooperation between France and Germany in research and development on hydrogen or on new sources of energy, for example. You know my stance on the wind power scam. No need to come back to that, but I would like to underline that wind power does have many adversaries in Germany. In the field of defence now, Germany has diverging interests from ours. It is considered naturally as it looks after its security, which leads it to buy American defence, ground, air, military combat planes, and it does not have a full military army. Pacific, because of its late rearmament that is just catching up because of underinvestment, it is condemning the export of weapons that it does not perceive as a prolongation of its diplomatic forces. Counter-nuclear or anti-nuclear, but paradoxically carrying out the nuclear program for NATO, it cannot remove the cornerstone of our defence. Patriotic, it pursues the defence of its interests in space, going from satellite shared capacity with France to a solution that is purely German in both areas, as it pursues it in programs that are collaborative and where its requirements in terms of governance and technology are reversely proportional to its weight, its investments, and to its steps forward. Germany, therefore, is the absolute negation of the French strategic ideology based on independence, dissuasion, and a model of army and full industrialization on a world rank. Let's look at these main basic differences that are irreconcilable. We will stop all cooperation with Berlin, combat planes, fighter planes, future tanks, to pursue our own programs to replace the Leclerc tank and the Rafale. I'll also stop support from France to the claim of Germany for a permanent seat on the Security Council of the United Nations. I, however, would like to nourish French-German friendship with several measures. One is the relaunch of learning German in schools, and also French teaching and secondary school teaching that has collapsed since the fall of the wall. In the context of the reinstalling of the Cadre d'Orient, the West, I will merge competitions and re-establish German in the external competition in the Central Europe and Eastern section. I'm thinking of the language, but also of German culture. I wish also to strengthen more concretely the use of German and French within European institutions that, and I apologize to say this, do not have a vocation to remain de facto or only exclusively English-speaking. This can only be done in agreement with the other member states. But the European Union has no purpose in being, or no interest in being English-speaking. Language is not just a technical aspect, it's also a very political subject that has an influence on the way of thinking nowadays. English-speaking engenders a neoliberal way of thinking often. And I'd like to strengthen further exchanges and partnerships between academics and scientists on either side of the Rhine. I wish to beef up the Office for Youth, Franco-German Office for Youth, and as opposed to its current way of doing things where they just carry out ridiculously unimportant activities. France and Germany know each other little, and Germany remains an exotic place to go to by French people. And so I wish to contribute to sorting this issue out and turning it around. Finally, on a trilateral plane, I would like to relaunch the Weimar Triangle with Poland that has been dormant pretty much since its creation in 1991, which is a challenge in itself. Carrying on with our journey towards Asia-Pacific, China is a very specific region and area, and I would like to base myself more on our academics and researchers, on all of our companies based there, and not just on Jean-Pierre Raffarin. A former ambassador to Beijing explained that the Beijing authorities only understood power, that we needed to deal exclusively on an equal-to-equal position, and that the French authorities did not actually always understand this. The culprit behavior of our leaders showed submission, including to attract Chinese tourists. It has to be stopped. We will contribute to getting international law respected, maritime law respected, including in areas of the globe where French power is present. We are power in Asia Pacific and Oceania through our ultramarine presence, military presence, through our national navy. We also we will develop our partnership with Japan, Korea, and various other countries. Through our ultramarine territories, with strengthened protection, we will consolidate our presence in Asia, Oceania, and we will not follow the Biden administration, which of course requires enemies to bring together its enemies under its domination, that I feel, without any polemic thought, too aggressive as regards Beijing. I say that we need equidistance. Once I am elected, I will maintain relations with Beijing, equal-to-equal relations within the respect of our sovereignty, and also in regions in Asia and Pacific where France is actually present. To illustrate my desire to renew with the bilateral experiment from the French diplomatic corps within the context of reaffirming the reach of France.
All right, you've been listening live there to the far-right candidate for the French presidency, Marine Le Pen, speaking here in Paris to lay out a little of her foreign policy programme. You heard her talk there about her plans for France's relations with Algeria, with Lebanon, with Germany. Notable, though, during the first 20 minutes of that speech or so, we didn't hear her talk about the war in Ukraine nor Russia. Well, let's talk to our foreign affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert, who's been in the studio with me. And Doug, was she skirting around the key foreign policy issues here?
Of course she was. This was equivalent to giving a news conference, say, on September 11th, 2001, and not mentioning the attack on the Twin Towers. I mean, I'm not trying to be glib here. She is giving a press conference on foreign policy ahead of a presidential election in 11 days' time, while there is a war raging on Europe's doorstep, a war perpetrated by Russia, an invasion by Russia on Ukraine, a war that has basically sucked the oxygen out of all other issues on the world stage, has everyone in the world riveted on it, focused on it. And Marine Le Pen gives a press conference on foreign policy, and she's still going on. She still has not mentioned it. She had time to talk, as you said, about the Comoros Islands, about Tunisia. She talked about, France would not support Germany's bid for a Security Council seat at the UN. She talked about her desire to see, rather than a multilateral approach to world affairs, bilateral partnerships. That is, dealing with countries one-on-one, rather than trying to cobble together alliances, rather than trying to work with countries in a collective, as has been Macron and most French presidents' policies in modern times. So it's been a press conference that so far, they often say press conferences are all about the questions and answers that follow it. And assuming she will be taking questions, that's really the only part of the press conference that will be worth listening to right now, because there was nothing substantial in terms of foreign policy or elucidating that has come out of the past 20 minutes. She did say at one point that she will definitely remove France from the integrated command of NATO, but that's not a news headline. We've known that she is anti-NATO. She basically blames NATO for the war in Ukraine, which is echoing what has long been sort of a right and far right talking point. So yeah, she would remove France from the integrated command, which is not to say she would pull France out of NATO, but undoubtedly she probably agrees with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was the third candidate, the far left candidate knocked out of the runoff, probably agreed that ultimately France has no place in NATO. France would be better off doing things on its own sovereignty, its own defense. So look, it's a very uninformative foreign policy press conference so far. At least if you went in hoping to have some things clarified about, yes, a relationship with Vladimir Putin, what would she do going forward with the coalition in the war in Ukraine? How would she relate to the biggest transatlantic partner, the United States? We have heard zip, none of that so far.
Fascinating, Doug. And she was at pains during the bit of the speech that we listened to emphasize how she considers herself very different on the world stage to Emmanuel Macron. Is there any overlap, though, in the way that they see France's place?
Is there any overlap? I guess, okay, if you want to go back, talk about the Ukraine war, sure, on the refugee issue. Unlike the other far-right candidate, even more to the right than she is, Eric Zemmour, who was knocked out with an abominable score in the first round of the elections, she is not opposed to welcoming refugees in France. Eric Zemmour said, yeah, fine, refugees, but let them go to Poland. They're not coming to France. She says, of course, we would welcome them here in France. So there, I guess you could say, if you're asking me about overlap in their policy, sure. And she's also condemned the war in Ukraine. She thinks it's atrocious. She thinks it's horrible, just as everyone else who's watching this with any degree of rationality thinks. So she's condemned the war, but that's an overlap, but then quickly that overlap diverges, because while she condemns the war, she doesn't hard link Vladimir Putin necessarily to that war. As we said earlier, her ties to Putin are well known. She met with him in 2017, and during this campaign more recently, since the invasion, she said, quote, I have partly changed my mind about Putin. I've partly I mean, how do you partly change your mind about Putin? What does that mean? She's never really clarified that.
Well, we'll wait and see later on this afternoon whether we do get any more clarity from Marine Le Pen on her views on Vladimir Putin. But for now, Douglas Herbert, thank you very much. And thanks to you as well for watching this show on France 24. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back with more news in about 15 minutes.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Delon D'Souza. Coming up on the show this week, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett vows there won't be any limits to the Israeli response after a spate of attacks rocked the country in recent weeks. Ripple effects from Russia's invasion of Ukraine being felt in Yemen, pushing the country further to the brink of famine. And an environmental project over in Iraq sees volunteers taking out trash from the banks of the Tigris. But first, there have been a spate of attacks which have taken place in Israel in the past 3 weeks. The incidents picking up during the holy month of Ramadan, a time of year when tensions between Israelis and Palestinians are typically high. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has warned that Israel is now on the offensive and there won't be any limits to its response. Alison Sargent reports.
Crowds of mourners fill the streets of Jenin, carrying the body of a 17-year-old Palestinian. The boy was killed by the Israeli army during their ongoing operation in the West Bank.
Mohammed was returning from work to break his fast when an Israeli military vehicle passed by and shot him.
Similar scenes in Bethlehem at the funeral of another young Palestinian killed in clashes with Israeli soldiers. The West Bank raids came in response to Thursday's attack in Tel Aviv. A Palestinian gunman opened fire on the terrace of a restaurant in the center of the city, killing a 35-year-old father and two 27-year-old men.
We thought we could start our lives, make a home, be a family, marry, have kids, be happy, and have our lives together. But those dreams have been shattered.
The Tel Aviv attack was the fourth Israel had seen in 3 weeks, killing a total of 14 people. The morning after, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett gave Israeli forces free rein to go after anyone believed to be a threat.
There are no and will be no limits for this war. We are granting full freedom of action to the army, the intelligence services, and all security forces in order to defeat terror.
The military raids are focused on the city of Jenin, considered a stronghold of Palestinian militants and the home of the two most recent attackers. At least 5 Palestinians have been killed since the operation began, and dozens of others wounded or arrested.
The occupation's escalation can only be met with a response. The Palestinian people cannot turn the other cheek to this criminal occupation that kills us in cold blood in Jenin and elsewhere.
Around the West Bank, protesters have gathered in solidarity with Jenin and in support of the Palestinian resistance. Israeli police have been targeted by several knife attacks. The assailants shot and killed each time.
For more on this story, we can bring in Elizabeth Shepherd-Salam, researcher in international relations and security, as well as director of the Politics and International Relations program at the University of Tours. Good to have you with us here on France 24. What is it about this time of year that we see this uptick in violence?
So, as your report was reminding us, it's Ramadan, of course, and it's not only in Israel, but more generally speaking, we see an uptake in terrorist attacks of this nature. So obviously in Israel as well. We saw this in Iraq, we saw this elsewhere. So it is obviously a very good period, if we can say that, use the word, for this type of attack. And given that Passover and Easter are also in the mix, it is a religiously symbolic period.
Israeli forces have responded. They've carried out raids on the Palestinians in the West Bank. We tend to know how these raids go. They're heavy-handed. They can humiliate, and then we see the violence picking up again. What could end this cycle of violence?
Well, I think that despite it's not only about the Israelis. I think that on both sides there are a lot of factors that keep us from negotiations or keep us from ending peace. Yes, the activities, the military activities have gone after and happily thwarted terrorist activities. But we also see, for example, one of the attackers in Tel Aviv was the son of a retired security officer of the Palestinian Authority, and his father welcoming the attack as well. So as long as both sides aren't willing to negotiate and sort of bring the level down, it is a very difficult situation.
Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has warned that, there won't be any limits to Israel's response. But we did have the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who did issue a condemnation for some of these attacks. Shouldn't that be an opportunity for the Israelis to say, let's sit down and have a dialogue about this?
He condemned one attack, and it's very rare. It's not something, on the contrary, we've seen a lot of, on the contrary, not of condemnation in the Palestinian Authority of more celebrating these attacks, with the exception of the Bnei Brak attack that he did indeed condemn. So it's not as simple as that, unfortunately.
Naftali Bennett is experiencing some problems on the political stage. One MP has resigned and his coalition is even further put in jeopardy. Does that limit what he's able to do?
Well, indeed, it limits what he's able to do, and it's pushing him to the right to make sure that he doesn't have other defections, because the defections are obviously more linked to the right part of his coalition. Remember that the coalition goes everywhere from the Islamic parties to the right, in a sort of coalition of anything but not Netanyahu. And it's becoming very difficult in a situation. As long as there was peace or relative peace, it was easy. Now that there's a very big sense of insecurity on the part of the population, it becomes very difficult to maintain his position without stepping more towards the right to make sure that he has more support.
Elizabeth Shepherd-Salam, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today.
Thanks.
In other news, the head of Yemen's newly created presidential council says the 7-year war between the Saudi-backed coalition and Houthi rebels will end through a peace process. President Rabu Mansur Hadi delegated power to the body from Riyadh as a 2-month ceasefire is in effect in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is calling on the council to negotiate with the Houthis under the auspices of the United Nations. The conflict has created the world's worst humanitarian crisis and is seen as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is having ripple effects around the world, including over in Yemen. There are fears of a grain shortage for the country, which was already on the brink of famine. Selena Sykes reports.
In northwest Yemen, farmers are hard at work, harvesting and grinding wheat that will be dispatched across the country. It's a staple food ingredient for the 30 million population, but one that is fast running out. Yemen usually relies on wheat imports that are now under threat because of Russia's war in Ukraine.
If the war in Ukraine continues, the price of wheat is going to go up even more. And then there's also the price of petrol. If that continues to rise, the cost of transport will increase too, and that's going to hit the population hard.
Ukraine and Russia are both big wheat exporters. Their production has taken a massive hit because of the war. resulting in shortages and rising prices.
We're still finding flour for the time being, but we're scared of running out. That's why we're asking traders to import a sufficient stock, and we're calling on affected authorities to produce wheat here in Yemen in order to become self-sufficient.
The situation is particularly concerning for Yemen, whose economy has already been devastated by 7 years of civil war. The country is on the brink of famine. The United Nations has warned that 2/3 of the population could need supplies from its food programme in the second half of the year.
Next, to a rare environmental project taking place over in Iraq, an army of young volunteers who say they want to be part of the solution have been cleaning up garbage from the banks of the Tigris. Claire Rush reports.
With gloves and garbage bags, scores of Baghdad residents pick up the trash littering the banks of the Tigris. They're volunteering for the Cleanup Ambassadors, a local environmental activist group.
Before we started this cleanup campaign, it was sad to see areas near the river. We couldn't even take pictures. But now, after the cleanup, it feels a lot better.
The first aim is to raise awareness and spread our message. There are children, young people and adults cleaning up and supporting this campaign.
Iraq has a trash problem, as seen here in the southern city of Basra. Amidst decades of conflict and political turmoil, the country has struggled to build the proper infrastructure for waste collection and disposal. As a result, litter pollutes its water, land, and air. Most garbage ends up in open dumps where it is burned. The waste poses a threat not only to the environment, but to humans as well.
Waste in Iraq is a major problem. In Iraq, 5 million cubic meters of waste are dumped daily into the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This means that Basra residents are drinking polluted water.
Aid groups have accused the government of poor management and weak governance. Experts say Iraq's environmental and public health problems stemming from waste are likely to intensify due to climate change and increasing water scarcity.
That's it for this edition of Middle East Matters. From all of us on the team, thank you very much for watching.
Beyond the News. A daily opportunity to go beyond the headlines and explore the news in depth. Revisited. A return to places which were in the news a long time ago. Reporters. Our in-depth reports on international news. The 51%, a program about women reshaping our world. The Observers. Meet our observers who alert us to hidden realities. Focus. Exclusive reports by our correspondents and journalists. And Down to Earth. On the vast potential of our planet. Every day, watch Beyond the News on France 24 and France24.com.
Some of the world's most influential people talk to France 24.
Government cannot do much promotion of human value.
Politicians. Scientists, athletes and artists. Get all the insight.
The government is still spying.
And the voices that matter on France 24.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Les voisins du 12 bis.
Bonjour, passeport s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour.
Qu'est-ce que vous venez faire en France?
Sorry, je ne comprends pas.
Follow the adventures of Billy, a young student settling down to life in Paris.
À louer, 2 pièces, 37 mètres carrés.
1,200 euros.
And learn the French for everyday situations.
Je peux vous aider?
Des tickets s'il vous plaît.
Find the exercises and learning tools for the series on savoir.rfi.fr.
France 24, your economy explained. Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Russia claims 1,000 Ukrainian Marines have surrendered in Mariupol and that victory is close in the key city. But the mayor of Mariupol insists the fighting isn't over yet. Meanwhile, Ukraine's security services arrest Putin's most influential ally in the country. Viktor Medvedchuk had been on the run. Those latest images, though, show him detained and handcuffed. And the French election campaign turned its focus to foreign policy today. Far-right leader Marine Le Pen making a key speech this afternoon on the topic. News and analysis coming up during the programme. Those are our headlines on France 24. Thank you for joining us. I'm Nadia Massi, live in Paris. And we start with the news that Russia is claiming its forces are on the cusp of victory in Mariupol. The Defence Ministry said this morning that over 1,000 Ukrainian Marines have now surrendered there. Now, there's been no direct confirmation of that so far from the Ukrainian government in Kyiv, but speaking this afternoon, the mayor of Mariupol said the fighting for the city wasn't over yet. France 24's Caroline Lambolet has this.
On Tuesday, the Russian army escorted journalists in the besieged port city of Mariupol, showing them the bombed-out ruins of the theater, where hundreds are believed to have been killed. It was the Russians' latest show of force in the city, where hope has all but died out. On Wednesday, the Russian forces said that more than 1,000 Ukrainian Marines had surrendered.
In the city of Mariupol and the area of the metallurgical plant Ilich, as a result of successful offensive operations of the Russian armed forces and units of the Donetsk People's Republic militia, 1,026 Ukrainian Marines voluntarily laid down their arms and surrendered.
The Ukrainian Defense Ministry says it has no knowledge about any surrender, and that Russian forces are continuing their attacks on Yazovstal and the port area. But a Ukrainian presidential cabinet official recognized Tuesday that Ukrainian forces were surrounded and blocked in Mariupol. In his nightly address on Monday evening, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he believed Russia had killed at least tens of thousands of people in Mariupol. The city was once home to around 400,000 people, but many have fled. According to the Ukrainian authorities, tens of thousands of civilians remain trapped in the besieged port city.
Well, north of Mariupol lies another key Russian target, and that's Kharkiv. It is Ukraine's second city, and like Mariupol, it's been under sustained attack for weeks now. Today, the regional governor said 7 civilians have been killed there in the past 24 hours in shelling, and he added that a number of children had been injured as well. Staying with this story, Ukraine's security services have today announced the arrest of a close ally of Vladimir Putin who's facing treason charges. Viktor Medvedchuk is a Russian oligarch who led a pro-Kremlin party in Ukraine. He's been under house arrest since the beginning of the war, but recently evaded his captors. Selena Sykes has this.
A close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin captured by Ukrainian authorities. Viktor Medvedchuk had been in hiding since escaping house arrest in Ukraine during the first few days of Russia's invasion. Ukraine's security service announced his capture in a statement late on Tuesday, in a special operation praised by President Volodymyr Zelensky.
I find it particularly cynical of him to disguise himself as a soldier. What a soldier, what a patriot. Well, if Medvedchuk chose to wear a military uniform, he falls under the rules of wartime. I propose to Russia that we exchange this guy for yours, for our people, who are now in Russian captivity.
Medvedchuk is a close friend of Putin. The Russian president is the godfather of one of his daughters. The Ukrainian oligarch led the pro-Kremlin party Opposition Platform for Life, which aimed to steer the country away from the West. The 67-year-old is one of several pro-Moscow politicians accused of involvement in a plot unveiled by the US to set up a pro-Kremlin collaborative government ahead of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since his surprise election in 2019, President Zelensky has been leading a crackdown on Medvedchuk. In February last year, 3 pro-Russian TV channels widely believed to be owned by the tycoon were taken off air. Zelensky said it was a necessary move in the fight against Russian propaganda. Medvedchuk was later charged with treason, accused of selling military secrets to Moscow and exploiting Crimea's natural resources under Russia's occupation. His political party was swiftly suspended after the Russian invasion. Moscow has refused to comment on his detention.
Well, we can turn now to the French presidential election campaign, because the second-round runoff between Emmanuel Macron and his far-right rival Marine Le Pen will be held in just 11 days. And this afternoon, Le Pen has been speaking here in Paris about her foreign policy agenda. Now, that speech is still going on right now, but let's have a listen to a bit of what she had to say earlier on.
Independence is the necessary condition for all mediation and arbitration and for any enterprise. France can only be useful in solving the world's great problems if and only if it's independent. This is the paradox that globalists don't understand, but that we nationalists know to be an eternal truth. This is one of the reasons why I want to leave NATO's integrated command.
Well, we can bring in now our foreign affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert, who's been listening to lots of that speech for us. And Doug, Marine Le Pen speaking just a short while ago, saying that she does now believe in closer ties between NATO and Russia. How should we understand that?
Well, first of all, good luck with that right now, given the current geopolitical situation. That's a euphemism, obviously. How do we understand that? Well, first of all, it's nothing actually. It's not an earthquake. It's not a bombshell. There has been, on many occasions throughout the decades, a cooperation between NATO and Russia at very different times in the relationship between Russia and Europe and the United States. You've had things like the NATO-Russia Council. You've had Russia was the first country way back in the 90s during Boris Yeltsin's presidency. I think it was 1994. Russia was the first country to join what was called the Partnership for Peace, which was a program of literally that, partnership, not membership, where you cooperated. Countries that were not members would cooperate militarily with NATO, with the goal eventually of joining. Georgia also at one point was a member of the Partnership for Peace. Obviously, a lot of this cooperation was suspended, especially the NATO Council work during the Georgia War back in 2008. When Crimea was annexed, 2014, all of the cooperation between Russia and NATO between 2014 and 2020 really suspended, totally suspended, even as they kept the channels of political and military communication open. That is, they had channels and ways to communicate with each other, but there was no effective cooperation anymore. And clearly now, since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia on February 24th, any notion of cooperation, it seems right now so far-fetched, because it raises all these, what would that cooperation entail? What would the goal of that cooperation be? And how, in any way, shape, or form, could it have anything to do with the types of cooperation we saw in the past during very different eras and times in Russia's history? Russia is right now in a very dark time where all dissent essentially has been stifled within the country. You have a situation with which one leader has consolidated control. Yes, his popularity and approval ratings at home are extremely high. That's because partially no one's allowed to say anything against him. It is not exactly the same spirit that we saw back in the 90s, or even before that in the late 80s, when Mikhail Gorbachev spoke of a Russian leader who spoke of, or Soviet leader, our common European house. I haven't heard Vladimir Putin in the past, 10, 15, almost 20 years talk of our common European house. So NATO cooperation, NATO rapprochement, she says, when the war is over. She's also said she's seen no obstacle to perhaps France working with Putin once the war is over and these issues are resolved. That's much easier said than done from the perspective, the vantage of where we stand today in the midst of a raging war, which is right now entering a new and potentially much more brutal and more dangerous phase. So cooperation with NATO and Russia, it takes a quantum leap of faith right now to even begin to envision what that would look like at this particular juncture in history.
It looks like Marine Le Pen is still taking questions in the room there from journalists. Doug, one of the other interesting items to come out of this is the confirmation today from Marine Le Pen that she no longer believes in Frexit, in the French exit from the EU, but she does want to reform it internally. Yeah. To be clear, and to be fair to Marine Le Pen, she has repeatedly said that, yes, she did campaign on Frexit, a French exit of the European Union, like Brexit, back in 2017, the last time she went head-to-head with Macron in an election, and she lost that time around. She has said, however, that it's no secret that despite the fact she doesn't want to she's given up the pulling out France of Europe, she is very much, her agenda, everything about her agenda, aims to sort of make Europe weaker. Now, she might not put it that way, but what she does say is France should be stronger. Everything in her agenda is about returning sovereignty, as she sees it, to France. And she came down very hard in her comments just a few minutes ago against the talk when Macron speaks of greater European sovereignty, greater European power to do what it wants. She does not like when you attribute that power or that sovereignty to Europe. She says, when you speak about sovereignty, you should be speaking about your national interests. She really is, in that case, a make France great again type of president, a France first type of president, very much in the Trump mold. They really see eye to eye on that issue. Rather than making that collective, the multilateral collective of nations stronger, investing them with greater powers, which ultimately the object would be in everyone's individual interest, she says, turn into France, worry about France first, and then take it from there. France working one by one, one-on-one, she used the phrase deepening bilateralism. Deepening bilateralism literally means that. Deepening relations one-on-one, face-to-face with each state individually, picking and cherry-picking and choosing your relationship with each of the states in Europe, rather than doing so as a collective, and banish the thought for Marine Le Pen of anything where EU laws, EU legislation takes primacy over national French laws. Really interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Doug, for breaking down a little of Marine Le Pen's speech for us there. We'll have more on her speech later on this afternoon, but in the meantime, let's bring you some other developing news this afternoon. This out of the Ivory Coast, where the Prime Minister, Patrick Atchi, has announced that he is to resign. No immediate reason given this afternoon for his departure, but the President, Alassane Ouattara, has accepted his resignation and says a new Prime Minister will be appointed next week. Now, New York City police today say they've named the main suspect following a shooting at a subway station yesterday that left more than 20 people injured. He's been named as 62-year-old Frank James. Selena Sykes tells us more about him.
A scramble for answers. A manhunt is underway after an attack on New York's subway during morning rush hour on Tuesday. Chaos and panic broke out in Brooklyn's 36th Street station as a man detonated 2 smoke grenades and opened fire on commuters.
When I came out, I saw a cloud of smoke and I saw people in chaos laying on the floor, 3 people on the floor, and it automatically told me to run.
I saw people running from 25th Street and 36th Street train station both ways without any direction, with blood all over them.
The attacker fired 33 times from a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, which was recovered at the scene, along with 3 extended magazines, a hatchet and smoke grenades. The man fled the scene. Police have named a person of interest in connection to this van, which they say may be linked to the shooting. 62-year-old Frank James has made a number of posts on social media criticising the policies of New York City's mayor, according to investigators.
Mr. James is just a person of interest we know right now who rented that U-Haul van in Philadelphia. The keys to that U-Haul van were found in the subway in our shooter's possessions. We don't know right now if Mr. James has any connection to the subway. That's still under investigation.
Authorities say the attack is not being treated as an act of terrorism. New York has seen a sharp rise in violent crime on public transport over the past 2 years, prompting its mayor to increase police patrols.
All right, those are our top stories on the programme. Thanks for watching and do stay tuned. There's more still to come here on France 24.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith.
All the latest in politics, economics and the arts in Africa on France 24. Our journalists are in every region, every country, to report on the emergence of a continent of unparalleled riches. Bringing you Africa's stories on France 24.
Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the 51%, a show about women reshaping our world. Coming up. Despite abortion being legal in Spain, a number of doctors in the public system still refuse to carry out the procedure, calling themselves conscientious objectors. Their stance forcing women to use private clinics. We head to Kibera in the Kenyan city of Nairobi, which is Africa's largest urban slum, and where women outnumber men as they struggle to exit a life of poverty. Plus, we meet the Lebanese gay female stand-up comic who has no fear when it comes to breaking taboos. But we begin in Spain, where some 100,000 abortions are carried out each year. In theory, terminations are a right under Spanish law, but in practice, a number of women face obstacles when they choose to terminate a pregnancy. This is the doctors carrying out the procedure say they are stigmatised by their pro-life colleagues, as our team on the ground report.
For this Spanish woman, getting an abortion proved a nightmare. A few years ago, she lived in the Canary Islands in Lanzarote. There wasn't a single clinic on the island of 150,000 residents that would carry out an abortion.
I had to go to a clinic on another island, on Gran Canaria, because it wasn't possible in Lanzarote. I didn't tell anyone. So that I didn't suffer repercussions at work, I had to take a day's holiday.
It's a common situation in the Canary Islands, but also throughout the rest of Spain. Out of 50 provinces across the country, no abortions are carried out in 11. A postcode lottery affecting millions of women.
I felt I was being laughed at. The right to a safe, legal and free abortion should be guaranteed no matter where you live, or at least wherever there's a health centre. If someone finds it difficult to access a right, it's not a right at all, it's a privilege.
Only 15% of abortions are carried out in public clinics. The vast majority of doctors cite a conscience clause to not perform terminations. These pro-life demonstrators defend the common use of that clause.
It's a fundamental right, the right to respect for religious beliefs. In public medicine, lots of professionals think you shouldn't harm fetuses.
The socialist government is studying the possibility of creating a list of conscientious objectors. They want to ensure enough doctors to guarantee the right to an abortion throughout Spain. A list criticised by the doctors and students here. Most of them are women.
I speak for most of the health professionals. Don't draw up a list of conscientious objectors because you won't have enough ink.
The situation means 200 private clinics are subsidised to perform about 85% of abortions. This centre was the first to carry out terminations in Spain.
Vale, la fecha de la última regla, ¿cuándo ha sido?
Sonia Lamas works here as a psychologist. She says doctors receive too little training on carrying out abortions, training which is supposed to be obligatory.
Sabemos que ninguna comunidad autónoma en España.
No Spanish region is training its health professionals, and the new generation isn't trained to take over duties.
Problema de relevo generacional.
She says professionals who work in abortion clinics are stigmatised.
It would be very difficult if I wanted to move out of this specialism because my CV would be tainted. There's a stigma attached to helping perform abortions.
Until now, pro-life protest groups have often been present outside clinics as women in vulnerable situations arrive for abortions. The most active, the Catholic group 40 Days for Life, who stand outside the buildings during Lent. Mercedes Abad turns up when she can.
We don't come here to harass or to talk to the clinic's workers, the mothers, or those who accompany them. We just come to pray. That's the most powerful weapon we have.
The group is active in 8 cities. On this day, the members were pleased with the results of their protest.
España hemos salvado, gracias a Dios, 8 vidas con sus respectivas madres.
But the Spanish Parliament has now criminalised such tactics. Those who use them will face up to a year behind bars. The new law means one less obstacle for Spanish women who need an abortion.
Now, Kibera is the largest slum in the Kenyan city of Nairobi and the largest urban slum in Africa. It's also where there are 116 women for every 100 men. Our team reports on why women are struggling more than men to find a way out of poverty.
Hello.
Helen makes calls every morning looking for a job. She's a single mother who lives with 2 of her children.
They gave me even 150 or 200, but you do big job, but small money.
With less than €2 a day, it's impossible to get out of poverty. It's barely enough to pay her rent.
This house is 2,000. I cannot afford to go in the hospital and pay this rent and school fee and whatever. That's why I lose my hope.
Nairobi hosts 60% of the country's informal settlements, including Kibera, where for every 100 men, there are 116 women. This community organization blames the imbalance on a patriarchal culture.
In this society, we give birth when we are young. So you are a kid and you have a kid, like from 15 years, people are giving birth. You see, but the man has that privilege. They will go and look for a job and find. A man who is 15 years is capable of completing their school, even if they are fathers, but a woman will stay at home. So we have so many challenges that brings the woman back.
Kenya's 2010 constitution emphasizes gender equality, but today, women still face greater disadvantages. Jana Oko is running for a seat in Nairobi's county assembly. She says the country needs more women in power.
We have a lot of resources. If you go to our women rep or even the MP, they have a Uwezo fund, they have the women fund. But does this fund really go to the woman at the ground? Somebody must stand in and ensure that what belongs to the local woman comes to the local woman.
The 2021 World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report shows that if things continue as they are, it may take Kenya roughly 138 years to achieve gender parity.
And finally, we head to Lebanon to meet a stand-up comic who has no fear in poking fun at religion, politics or homosexuality. Shaden Fakir, who's openly gay, refuses to shy away from topics that are often considered taboo in Arab society.
This may be comedy, but it's not all light-hearted giggles. It's through the lens of stand-up that Shaden Fakir is able to bear her true self. She speaks openly about being gay and is unapologetically blunt about other taboos in Lebanese society.
In stand-up comedy, I am myself, though with a performance for sure. I am living my absolute truth within my convictions, be it my view of religion, my view of existence, my view of society, my view of sex, my experience in sex, or my experience as a lesbian woman. I don't want to hide myself.
Tonight's show has gone well. For some in the audience, Fakir's comedy is a vehicle for change, while others are a little taken aback.
It's controversial a bit, but it's a very nice show.
She's raising awareness on issues we have in Arab societies, but in a humorous way. She doesn't come attacking people and saying, "You were wrong." No, she's making you laugh about it, so that you realize on some level that you are doing something wrong.
While it's home to one of the most vibrant feminist scenes in the Arab region, Lebanon has one of the highest overall gender gaps in the world. The labour force participation rate for women stands at 29%. According to a UN report, some 2/3 of women have experienced sexual harassment in public spaces, while spousal violence stands at around 25%. With 65,000 followers on social media, Shaden Fakir is spreading new ideas to a wide audience, normalising a different kind of voice for women in the country's still male-dominated world of comedy.
And that's it for this edition. You can get in touch and keep up with the 51% on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. And you can watch all our previous shows on France 24 website. So until our next program, bye for now.
I'm Natalie Savaricas, and you'll usually find me in news, reporting on Greece's enduring financial turmoil and protests, but also the refugee emergency, here on France 24.
Natalie Savaricas, one of the 200 France 24 correspondents around the world.
Yuki Chizui is a pioneer. She's the first woman in Japan to manage her own sushi restaurant. With her all-female crew, she's achieved rare success in a sector long dominated by men.
At the fish market, the sellers sometimes gave me funny looks, and there have been some negative remarks. I could see in their eyes that they were thinking, "What is she doing here?" It was like I was an alien. That was difficult for me.
Some believe that women make inferior sushi because their menstrual cycle affects their sense of taste, and because their higher core body temperature adversely affects fresh ingredients. Chizui is having none of it.
A lot of men in the restaurant industry smoke. I think that's more of a problem.
Even today, just 1 in every 100 restaurants serving Japanese cuisine is owned by a woman. But at this culinary school near the old fish market in Tokyo's Tsukiji neighborhood, almost 1/3 of the students are women.
Men easily tire of performing certain tasks, but women are often more focused, more tenacious. 25-year-old Yui Kasanagi hopes to see change in the restaurant industry. She had to quit her job at a restaurant where she put in 14-hour shifts after she became pregnant.
I had no other choice but to quit, and that's a shame. I hope things improve, so there are no longer any barriers between men and women.
Like other parts of Japan's economy, sushi restaurants are being propped up by older men. Now, though, the time has come for women to breathe new life into this highly symbolic cuisine.
Versailles, Mont Saint-Michel, the Louvre are well-known stars of French heritage. But French genius and France harbours many other hidden treasures. The arts, gastronomy, architecture, as well as nature's wonders. Come along with France 24, discover France's living heritage. From young apprentices to accomplished craftsmen and farmers, to Michelin star sporting chefs, meet these people whose passion for their professions preserve and drive French heritage.
You are here on France 24 and France24.com.
Russia claims 1,000 Ukrainian Marines have surrendered in Mariupol and that victory there is close. But the mayor of Mariupol insisting the fight isn't over yet. France 24 on the ground in the Kyiv region. Our team finds devastation in the suburb of Borodianka, which until recently was occupied by Russian forces. And the French election campaign turns its focus to foreign policy today. Far-right leader Marine Le Pen making a key speech on the topic this afternoon. News and analysis coming up during the show. Well, those are our headlines on France 24. Thank you for joining us. And we start with the news that Russia today is claiming its forces are on the cusp of victory in Mariupol. Its defense ministry said this morning over 1,000 Ukrainian Marines had now suspended there. Now, there's been no direct confirmation of that from the Ukrainian government in Kyiv, but speaking this afternoon, the mayor of Mariupol said the fighting for the city wasn't over yet. France 24's Caroline Lamboulay has this.
For the past hours, Russian state television has been broadcasting these images, showing what it says are more than 1,000 Ukrainian Marines who surrendered earlier on Wednesday. These images have not been verified, but they're said to have been shot in the industrial zone of the besieged port city of Mariupol, where the last Ukrainian soldiers have been mounting a stiff resistance.
In the city of Mariupol, in the area of the metallurgical plant Ilich, as a result of successful offensive operations of the Russian armed forces and units of the Donetsk People's Republic militia, 1,026 Ukrainian Marines voluntarily laid down their arms and surrendered.
The Ukrainian Defense Ministry says it has no knowledge about any surrender, and that Russian forces are continuing their attacks on Azovstal and the port area. But a Ukrainian presidential cabinet official recognized Tuesday that Ukrainian forces were surrounded and blocked in Mariupol. On Wednesday, the mayor of Mariupol said that forces in the city were still resisting.
It has to be said very clearly, their situation is very difficult because they are outnumbered. But they are resisting. Mariupol remains a Ukrainian city.
The location of Mariupol is strategic. If the town falls, it would give Russia a land bridge for troops and supplies between Russian-held areas to the west and east of the city. Ukrainian authorities say that between 10 and 22,000 people have died in Mariupol.
So that's the situation in Mariupol. Meanwhile, our chief foreign affairs editor, Rob Parsons, is currently in Borodyanka. And like the now infamous town of Bucha, it is in the Kyiv region and until recently was occupied by Russian forces. Our team there have found a town devastated and its population exhausted.
What you see here is what's left of the small town of Borodyansk, a town of about 13,000 people, 70 kilometers from Kiev, and important for the Russians when they invaded the country because of its position on one of the main roads leading into Kiev and a small airport nearby. It was one of the first places that the Russians took. A lot of civilians were killed, apparently. President Zelensky says the situation here was even worse than in towns like Bucha and Irpin. But the fighting here was particularly intense as well, hence the destruction you see around me. There were artillery battles, tank battles, there were aircraft strikes. Virtually all these houses here are either destroyed or uninhabitable. The ones you see behind me here are going to have to be knocked down. Operations are underway to demine the town. There's an awful lot of unexploded ordnance that has to be defused. For the moment, nobody's coming back to live in the town. There are a few people who stayed on and who survived, but the scene is desolate. It's going to be a long time before people can make this city come back to life again.
That's our chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons, reporting there from the suburbs of Kyiv. Well, we can turn now to the French election campaign because the second round runoff between President Emmanuel Macron and far-right rival Marine Le Pen will be held in 11 days. And this afternoon, Le Pen has been speaking about her foreign policy programme. Now, quite a few talking points coming out of that speech. Among them, she wants to reduce France's contribution to the EU budget, keep France in the 2015 climate deal. She does, though, want to shake up NATO. Have a listen.
Independence is the necessary condition for all mediation and arbitration and for any enterprise. France can only be useful in solving the world's great problems if and only if it's independent. This is the paradox that globalists don't understand, but that we nationalists know to be an eternal truth. This is one of the reasons why I want to leave NATO's integrated command.
Well, listening to that press conference was our foreign affairs commentator Douglas Herbert, who's with me now. And Doug, Marine Le Pen was taking questions from journalists in the room. She was asked about her relationship with Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader, and she sort of defended herself there, didn't she?
Yeah, her apparent past chumminess with Vladimir Putin, especially that famous photo of her in her campaign brochures, which was pulped, showing her smiling and shaking hands with Putin. She visited Moscow back in 2017. All of that is hung like an albatross around her campaign and has been really, seized upon by Emmanuel Macron in order to put her on the defensive here, that she's the woman who kept up a close, chummy relationship with Putin. What she basically she said that she's been put sort of on it's been an unfair trial that she's been subjected to. When it comes to Putin, she maintained that all she ever had done was to defend France's position. She said until the war in Ukraine, she believed that it would be in France's interests to make sure that France had as close as good a relationship, as close enough of a relationship as it could with Russia, and Russia right now happens to be a Russia under Vladimir Putin, in order partly once again in France's interest to prevent Russia from, joining at the hip with China, from striking partnerships with China. So she said, I was only doing this in France's interest. She thought that it was an unfair criticism that she's been subjected to. And she added that she believes that her approach to Putin and Emmanuel Macron's approach to Putin haven't really been that different, although they really have been different. But she maintains they've both basically, Macron too, has kept open dialogue and has kept talking to Putin throughout this war on multiple occasions. So she says she believes it's unfair. She's being singled out for, past photos that she's probably not proud of today, that she's been trying to put behind her, and has been, and as we recently said, she recently said, in the campaign after the invasion that she had partly changed changed her opinion of Putin and about what she called his indefensible decision to invade Ukraine. So you see, she's really shifting here. It's hard to really get your hands on what her exact position with Putin is, but she does know that it is a potential, cudgel blow, hammer blow to her campaign. At least it has really, really been nagging at her. So she had to react somehow. She knew this was going to be a question at this press conference. She was clearly ready with an answer.
Douglas Herbert, thanks very much indeed for your analysis. Well, let's move on now to some other world news and to the Ivory Coast, where the Prime Minister, Patrick Atchi, has announced that he's resigning this afternoon. No immediate reason was given for his departure, but the President, Alassane Ouattara, has accepted his resignation. He says he'll name a new Prime Minister next week. Now, today, police in New York City have named the main suspect following a shooting at a subway station yesterday that injured more than 20 people. He's now been named as 62-year-old Frank James. Selena Sykes tells us more.
A scramble for answers. A manhunt is underway after an attack on New York's subway during morning rush hour on Tuesday. Chaos and panic broke out in Brooklyn's 36th Street station as a man detonated 2 smoke grenades and opened fire on commuters.
When I came out, I saw a cloud of smoke and I saw people in chaos laying on the floor, 3 people on the floor, and it automatically told me to run.
I saw people running from 25th Street and 36th Street train station both ways without any direction, with blood all over them.
The attacker fired 33 times from a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, which was recovered at the scene, along with 3 extended magazines, a hatchet and smoke grenades. The man fled the scene. Police have named a person of interest in connection to this van, which they say may be linked to the shooting. 62-year-old Frank James has made a number of posts on social media criticising the policies of New York City's mayor, according to investigators.
Mr. James is just a person of interest we know right now who rented that U-Haul van in Philadelphia. The keys to that U-Haul van were found in the subway in our shooter's possessions. We don't know right now if Mr. James has any connection to the subway. That's still under investigation.
Authorities say the attack is not being treated as an act of terrorism. New York has seen a sharp rise in violent crime on public transport over the past 2 years, prompting its mayor to increase police patrols.
And those are our top stories on the programme. Thanks for watching and do stay tuned to France 24.
Exactement, alors j'ai besoin de votre passe sanitaire, monsieur.
The Camille of the past was lost, and she thought, what has my mother got me into? But the Camille of today is like, thank God my mother got me into this, because it's really something amazing.
They just called me up and I was like, oh, what do you want to, what can I help you with? And they were like, I thought it was a scam. I think that moment changed my life forever.
I will fight from my own point of view for making it something useful and not just a puppet show.
If it worked, it's the best project ever, I think.
800 citizens from the 27 member states of the European Union, 800 people out of Europe's 450 million strong population, each invited to debate and ponder the future of the EU, an exercise in democratic participation, both a collective and individual endeavor, which began last September with the aim of reinventing the bloc. Among them is Camille, a student from France, one of the youngest at just 16. She's joined the group looking into health and environmental issues.
Moi, je suis de Toulouse et je suis encore au lycée.
Quand vous êtes à l'aise, vous m'avez signalé, c'est ça?
Oui.
Si c'est bon ou non.
Faut dire quoi?
Ça n'est pas énervant, c'est absolument normal. Parce qu'il y a beaucoup de députés qui sont des politiciens, des hommes de femmes politiques professionnels, mais c'est très intéressant.
For the first time in her life to having her say in choosing the president.
And finally, there's always something beautiful about a pregnant woman, but pop star Rihanna goes above and beyond that description. She was the cover girl on this month's American Vogue, resplendent in a fiery red lace bodysuit. The singer has been unapologetic in her fashion-forward maternity wear, saying she wants to help redefine what's considered decent for pregnant women. She tweeted, "It's too much fun to get dressed up. I'm not going to let that part disappear because my body is changing." That's it for this edition. Thanks so much for watching Inside the Americas. We'll see you again next time for all the news from north to south.
For nearly half a century, Cyprus has been cut in two. In the north, the Turkish Cypriot government, and in the south, the Republic of Cyprus, Greek-speaking and Christian. Varosha, a former seaside resort and a symbol of the island's division, became a ghost town when it was abandoned by its inhabitants following the Turkish invasion in 1974. In 2019, Turkey reopened Varosha to tourists and to former residents. Long deprived of their right to return, they are now demanding the return of their property.
C'est moi qui me bats pour l'instant, mais je ne sais pas combien d'années je peux encore me battre.
Watch Varosha Revisited on France 24 and France24.com. Your needs are changing, and so is France24.com. With articles, reports, the latest international news, all our programmes available on replay, together with live broadcasting 24/7. Intuitive, fast, and available in 4 languages. France24.com. Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Hello and welcome. You're watching France 24. Coming up, Russia claims the surrender of more than 1,000 Ukrainian Marines in Mariupol, the bombed-out port city that's been surrounded for nearly 7 weeks. In this edition, we cross live to Kyiv and France 24's Robert Parsons. Less NATO, more distance with Germany. French far-right candidate Marine Le Pen spells out her vision on foreign policy ahead of the April 24th runoff of the presidential election. One day ago, Emmanuel Macron warning of her hidden project to leave the EU. Authorities warn of stiff punishment for Shanghai residents who break quarantine. This after a record 26,000 new daily cases of COVID in China's largest city. Will measure the impact around the world in this edition. In the next hour will be the France 24 debate. It's not just France holding its breath, Europe and NATO waiting on the winner of the April 24th presidential runoff here. Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen diametrically opposed on everything from how to handle Vladimir Putin to relations with Germany and the EU. Tell us what you think on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. No confirmation that the fall of Mariupol is imminent. More on that in a moment, and on Moscow's claim that after weeks of a brutal siege, the Russians are close to securing a land bridge between Crimea and their border. Now, speaking of brutal, as Russia redeploys to the east, France 24 able to get an up-close look at the desolation now that Ukrainian forces have secured points north of the capital. For more, we cross to Kyiv, and France 24 Chief International Affairs Editor Robert Parsons. Rob, what have you seen this Wednesday?
Well, we got a pretty good idea of how fierce the fighting has been in that area northwest of Kyiv. We drove to a small town called Borodyanka, which was described by President Zelensky as being worse in terms of the crimes committed by Russian troops against civilians in the town, worse than Bucha and Irpin. On the way to the town, about 15 minutes or so from getting there, we drove past a column of Russian tanks and armored vehicles, 11 in total, which have been completely destroyed. Then we got to the town of Borodyanka. Essentially, the center of the town is a ruin. Multi-story buildings are going to have to be torn down. They're completely uninhabitable. The effort to clean up the town is underway. The fire brigade is helping. There are volunteers helping. There are people checking to see whether there are mines, whether there's unexploded ordnance in the buildings. People looking to see whether there are any bodies under the brick and mortar that's fallen down. In sum, it's a pretty awful sight when you get there. A strong effort being made by the Ukrainians, well organized, to get things in hand and get it inhabitable as soon as possible. Some buildings have now had gas switched on. An attempt is being made to get electricity working and water running. But for many houses, it's still not the case. The authorities of the town are saying it's not safe for people to go back. But I have to say, we did come across quite a few people who were living there and who lived there throughout the fighting, who were able to tell us about how heavy it had been, how awful it had been, about the behavior of the Russian troops, about how they would go house to house looking for people who they suspected of being, as they would call it, nationalists or Nazis, telling the young men and boys to strip to their underwear so that they could see whether they had tattoos which indicated they had Nazi or nationalist affiliations, and if they did, they were then shot. So the situation has clearly been pretty grueling for the people who have lived there, but a major effort is being now made to get the place inhabitable again.
And where you are right now, you have taking stock of the damage as the country prepares for a new onslaught. Just in the last minute, Ukraine's Armed Forces Command saying that Russian forces are ready to attack in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia regions.
Yes, Francois, I mean, that has been the position now for a bit over a week, I guess. The Russians are building up their strength in the Donbass area. They're trying to press down from the town of Izium, which is between the Donbass and Kharkiv in the north on the Russian border, which has been under attack throughout this war so far for the last 6 weeks. And then there's the fighting that you referred to in the introduction in Mariupol, with that report made by the Russians that 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers from the 36th Marines had surrendered. That is categorically denied by the Ukrainian authorities. And certainly the Azov regiment inside Mariupol is continuing to fight. And President Zelensky is still calling for heavy weaponry, in part so that the Ukrainian army can make an effort to break into Mariupol and relieve the troops in the city.
Yeah, Rob, one question after everything you've just described. Those people, the ones who never left, what's their mindset right now? Are they ready for more fighting?
Their morale is pretty good. They have been through hell over the last few weeks. They were mostly elderly people. They're not the sort of people who are up for a fight, but you did get a sense of determination on their part that they want their country to see this through. They want Russia to be defeated, and that there's no way they want their country to be taken over by Russia. They've seen what the Russians have done whilst they've been here, and they want to be shot of them. They want to send them back to Moscow and wherever else they came from in Russia.
Robert Parsons reporting live from Kyiv. Many thanks for that update. Rob, telling us about that categorical denial on the part of Ukrainian authorities. The Russian Defense Ministry earlier asserting that more than 1,000 Ukrainian Marines had surrendered in the port of Mariupol, effectively making it the fall of that strategic port city imminent. Caroline Lambolet has more.
On Tuesday, the Russian army escorted journalists in the besieged port city of Mariupol. showing them the bombed-out ruins of the theater, where hundreds are believed to have been killed. It was the Russians' latest show of force in the city, where hope has all but died out. On Wednesday, the Russian forces said that more than 1,000 Ukrainian Marines had surrendered.
In the city of Mariupol, in the area of the metallurgical plant Ilich, as a result of successful offensive operations of the Russian armed forces and units of the Donetsk People's Republic militia, 1,026 Ukrainian Marines voluntarily laid down their arms and surrendered.
The Ukrainian Defense Ministry says it has no knowledge about any surrender, and that Russian forces are continuing their attacks on Azovstal and the port area. But a Ukrainian presidential cabinet official recognized Tuesday that Ukrainian forces were surrounded and blocked in Mariupol. In his nightly address on Monday evening, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he believed Russia had killed at least tens of thousands of people in Mariupol. The city was once home to around 400,000 people, but many have fled. According to the Ukrainian authorities, tens of thousands of civilians remain trapped in the besieged port city.
Russia has denounced the arrest of a close ally of Vladimir Putin, one of the richest men in Ukraine who had always been close to him. Viktor Medvedchuk escaped house arrest in the first days of the war. The Ukrainian oligarch had led a pro-Kremlin party inside of Ukraine.
A close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, captured by Ukrainian authorities. Viktor Medvedchuk had been in hiding since escaping house arrest in Ukraine during the first few days of Russia's invasion. Ukraine's security service announced his capture in a statement late on Tuesday, in a special operation praised by President Volodymyr Zelensky.
I find it particularly cynical of him to disguise himself as a soldier. What a soldier, what a patriot. Well, if Medvedchuk chose to wear a military uniform, he falls under the rules of wartime. I propose to Russia that we exchange this guy for yours, for our people, who are now in Russian captivity.
Medvedchuk is a close friend of Putin. The Russian president is the godfather of one of his daughters. The Ukrainian oligarch led the pro-Kremlin party Opposition Platform for Life, which aimed to steer the country away from the West. The 67-year-old is one of several pro-Moscow politicians accused of involvement in a plot unveiled by the US to set up a pro-Kremlin collaborative government ahead of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since his surprise election in 2019, President Zelensky has been leading a crackdown on Medvedchuk. In February last year, 3 pro-Russian TV channels widely believed to be owned by the tycoon were taken off air. Zelensky said it was a necessary move in the fight against Russian propaganda. Medvedchuk was later charged with treason, accused of selling military secrets to Moscow and exploiting Crimea's natural resources under Russia's occupation. His political party was swiftly suspended after the Russian invasion. Moscow has refused to comment on his detention.
The Kremlin's denounced Joe Biden's use of the word genocide to describe Russia's campaign in Ukraine. This in remarks Tuesday by the U.S. president in Iowa.
Yes, I called it genocide because it's become clearer and clearer that Putin is just trying to wipe out the idea of even being able to be a Ukrainian. And the evidence is mounting. It's different than it was last week. The more evidence is coming out of literally the horrible things that the Russians have done in Ukraine. And we're going to only learn more and more about the devastation.
Now, human rights activists point to the strict legal definition of the word genocide. Monty Francis has more.
It's the harshest criticism of the Kremlin by the U.S. so far. U.S. President Joe Biden accusing Vladimir Putin of committing genocide against civilians in Ukraine.
Your family budget, your ability to fill up your tank, none of it should hinge on whether a dictator declares war and commits genocide half a world away.
Later, boarding Air Force One, Biden said he stood by his comments.
We'll let the lawyers decide internationally whether or not it qualifies, but it sure seems that way to me. Thank you.
Whether it qualifies depends on a strict legal definition that was decided upon after the Holocaust. The Geneva Conventions in 1949 defined genocide as an intentional effort to completely or partially destroy a group based on its nationality, ethnicity, race, or religion. There is general agreement that at least 4 cases have met that international threshold: the Holocaust of Jews by the Nazis during World War II, the slaughter of the Armenians by the Turks in 1915, the 1994 mass killing of Tutsis in Rwanda, and the slaughter of thousands of Muslim men and boys in Bosnia, known as the Srebrenica massacre in 1995. Legal experts say that genocide is harder to prove than other violations of international law, such as war crimes and crimes against humanity, because it requires evidence of intent. At this point, the International Criminal Court is currently not investigating genocide charges against Russia, but its prosecutor has just launched a probe into possible war crimes or crimes against humanity Moscow may have committed in Ukraine.
Future relations with Russia, one of the keys to Marine Le Pen's press conference on foreign policy, this 11 days before the French presidential runoff. The far-right candidate, who received loans from Russian banks in the past to secure previous campaigns, was speaking at a press conference where she outlined her foreign policy, returning to normalized ties with Russia once the war in Ukraine is over, and France leaving the integrated command of NATO.
As soon as the Russia-Ukraine war is over and we have a peace treaty, I will propose a strategic rapprochement between NATO and Russia, as was formerly considered. It's in France's and Europe's interest, but also in the United States's, because it's absolutely not in their interest to see a strong Russian-Chinese union emerge.
For more, we turn to Douglas Herbert from our International Affairs Desk. Douglas, leaving the integrated command of NATO, and we heard a few snipes at the U.S. in that press conference.
Yeah, well, first of all, leaving the integrated command of NATO, it's something that obviously Charles de Gaulle did in 1966, right? Nothing new for France. And it's then Sarkozy, back in 2019, put France right back in it. She wants to take France out of that integrated command again. What it means is it doesn't mean that France would be leaving as a member. She still says France would be part of the Article 5, right? The famous, an attack against one is an attack against all. So she's not pulling out, but what she's basically doing, she wants to remove France. Why? From what's called that integrated command, which essentially means she does not believe a sovereign French army or any French military brass should be answering to the United States or to any foreign military commanders, whether they're in NATO or in Moscow. It doesn't matter. And so this is all, it boils down to that question of sovereignty. But let's not fool ourselves. She may not want to remove France from NATO, but that's really a concession, a part of the softening of her image and of her platform, the more moderating of her image in the past, 5 to 10 years, which has made her acceptable, almost appear mainstream to a lot of French. So while she's not taking France out of NATO, Francois, don't have any illusions that she's not very anti-NATO in her sort of ideological construct.
Yeah, Marine Le Pen, who back during the 2017 campaign already said she was no longer in favor of France quitting the euro and returning to the franc. Nonetheless, she did take aim at the European Union.
Frexit isn't our plan. But when the UK left the European Union, the French ruling class spoke of nationalistic and insular withdrawal and predicted catastrophe for the British. And that is not the case. But I repeat, that is not our plan. We want to reform the European Union from the inside. But the more we free ourselves from the rigidity of Brussels while staying in the EU, the more we can turn to the vast world. That's what the British have understood.
So basically an endorsement for Brexit.
High praise for Brexit, right? The Brits turned away from the, quote, Brussels bureaucracy towards this ambitious global Britain, that the Boris Johnson's project here. Look, once again, let's be very clear here and have no illusions. No, her platform in 2022, unlike 2017, does not include Frexit. That is pulling France out of the European Union. That's gone. And that's also because she's had to adapt to the French popular opinion. Most French do not want to, the polls show, pull out of Europe, even a lot of her voters right now. So she's modified her position. That doesn't mean she doesn't want to pull France out of Europe. And this is what Macron was speaking about this week. Don't be fooled, he's essentially saying. Her basic ideology, her basic long-term goal is for France to leave the European Union.
You were saying earlier how Marine Le Pen on this campaign has been successful in projecting this perception of being softer.
Yeah.
Did you get that impression when you sit down and you listen to a press conference that lasted an hour and a half?
Well, no, I mean, look, a lot of it, no, I didn't actually. I mean, she's trying. You could tell that she's making an effort to come across as reasonable, someone who's really thought out their foreign policy. But at the end of the day, I mean, look, most of the policies that she'd laid out today, she said she was going to cut off all military cooperation with Germany. The Franco-German engine has been part of at the heart of the European sort of relationship and relations going back to Mitterrand or even earlier. You know this, 4 or 5 decades right now. You know, what she said about NATO, which I didn't say in my previous answer, she wants to see a rapprochement between Europe and NATO in order to prevent sort of Russia and NATO after the war. What she left out is what after the war. So if Vladimir Putin is still in power, a man who at present is being accused by some of possible war crimes, does that mean that she's going to have this rapprochement with a post-Ukraine war Vladimir Putin? She's going to wait for another president in power? How would that rapprochement work? There has been cooperation between NATO and Russia in the past. Back under Yeltsin, there was a partnership for peace, you might remember, back in the mid-90s. It's been years since that. The plug was pulled on all of that after the Georgian war in 2008, and then again after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Russia in its current incarnation, if you will, under Vladimir Putin, it's hard really to see how there could be cooperation with NATO. That and a lot of other subjects. She did, but you're right, she did try to seem more moderate by saying things like she will not pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. That perhaps was a concession to the fact that France is not going to be able to pull out of it was the sponsor of the Paris Climate Agreement. It won't be able to pull out. And the Frexit is another concession. It's not going to pull out of Frexit. It's not going to pull out of the European single currency. That was also in her platform in 2017. So clearly she's trying to be more moderate. But I think if you read between the lines of this press conference at the end of the Day Francois, it's clear that in her mind, she has long-term goals, which are essentially the same as back in 2017.
All right, many thanks, Douglas Herbert. In South Africa, the city of Durban reeling from its worst flooding in 60 years. The death toll has climbed to 259. President Cyril Ramaphosa meeting with those grieving after hillsides were washed away, homes collapsed. More people are still feared missing from those torrential rains. Over in the Philippines, tropical storms, normally the season doesn't start this early, but it has because of climate change. At least 67 killed, 28 reported missing after a tropical depression unleashed days of rain in the center and south of the country. Tolano de Souza has that story.
Search and rescue operations now underway in the central Philippines. It's been made possible after the arrival of heavy equipment and the clearing up of the weather. 6 villages in the city of Baybay were hit by landslides over the weekend, and rescue workers have only now begun to uncover the dead.
I just hope he comes to us, even if it's only in our dreams. I miss him so much.
This was the moment a fresh landslide struck the province of Leyte on Tuesday. Tropical storm Meggy had already hit the area a day earlier and caused widespread flooding and landslides. Medics have rushed to treat survivors as local authorities verify who's still missing. This is the first tropical storm to hit the Philippines so far this year. The disaster-prone nation typically averages 20 storms a year during the monsoon season, which begins in June. But with climate change, the country has seen storms start earlier in the year, and according to scientists, their intensity has grown more powerful.
Shanghai police warn anyone who violates COVID-19 lockdown rules will be dealt with strictly. The stern message to China's largest city comes as the Omicron outbreak there is on the rebound. 26,000 new cases reported in the past 24 hours. Shanghai's been enforcing its zero COVID policy of quarantining entire neighborhoods, but there's also been blowback. In this video posted to social media, people are yelling from their windows. They've been confined to their homes for 7 days in one of Shanghai's biggest residential compounds. This after other instances of what's being labeled spontaneous screaming. Joining us is Jean-François Di president of the Asia Center think tank. Thanks for being with us. Your reaction to that?
Well, you know, Shanghai is China, but Shanghai is very different from the rest of China. And that probably explains what you just showed, but also probably the treatment that Shanghai is under as compared to other cities which have been confined as well, but probably not as strictly and not under the same conditions. The impact on the economy, of course, is different. The impact of Shanghai within the whole of China is different, so there is a specific treatment. Shanghai
is it a harsher treatment?
Yes.
Why?
Well, that's a good question, if I may. Well, because you cannot afford spreading the virus in a city like Shanghai and getting out of control. That's one very good reason for sure. The other reason is just what you showed, which is that of course, Shanghai is very well controlled and Shanghai functions very well overall in China, but you always think that there is a risk of, you know, Shanghai going out of the beaten track. And if you go back to, I would say, even the Cultural Revolution, even if you go back to the harshest days of a Chinese regime, Shanghai was always under scrutiny. Now it's a showcase of the success of China. You want to jeopardize the success of China just because Shanghai is under a very violent attack of the virus. That's probably explains. It's just, you know, I'm also puzzled. I was not expecting this.
And the numbers, they say there have been 200,000 cases so far and no fatalities.
Yes, because you do have a lot of asymptomatic cases. So the number of symptomatic cases is very limited. If we compare the ratio of sick people to the overall population in the rest of the world, of course, China is very low. Now, if you compare the ratio of sick people and deceased people, then the ratio is exactly the same in China so far, over 2 years and 2 months, as in the rest of the world. So that's a fact. The other fact is also the vaccine. It's obvious that the Chinese vaccine, first of all, the ratio is lower than in the rest of, I would say, the developed world. And also probably the efficiency of the vaccine is probably lower than what it is in the rest of the world.
The rest of the world, which is now opened up.
Yes.
The Chinese authorities standing by their zero COVID policy. Yeah. Let's listen to one health official defending the Chinese way.
Our practices in the past 2 years have shown that dynamic case clearing accommodates our national particularities and is the best option for us to combat the epidemic.
They're insisting that it's still zero COVID policy. Well, how long can they do that for?
Well, from a Western point of view, we would say it cannot last any longer. Now, if you look at other places in Asia, it's very close to being in line with the zero COVID. It's opening up marginally, but the obsession still is, as soon as the virus picks up, then we are getting very close to zero COVID. It's not zero COVID. So China definitely sticks to zero COVID. I would say probably one of the reasons is face reason, because in China it's very difficult to change tack And probably, I would say...
And is there also the other factor that you have that Communist Party Congress coming up in the fall?
Absolutely. And you don't want any problem before that. Now, there is a key question which is now in Li Keqiang's speech every day, almost every day, which is the price, Prime Minister and in charge of the economy. What's the impact on the growth rate? What the impact of what we will find at the end of the year 2022 in terms of, GDP and the wealth of Chinese people and all what has been said over years. If there is a failure, then it's a big question for the party, for sure.
Yeah, and it's not just for China that impact will be felt. Several electronic companies, including makers of iPhones and MacBooks, forced to shut right now because of the lockdown.
That's the ripple effect. And obviously, Chinese authorities don't care too much. That's quite strange as well. And Li Keqiang, once again, doesn't find that very rational.
Jean-François Dimeglu of the Asia Center, many thanks for being with us.
Thank you, François.
Stay with us. Much more to come on France 24. More news plus the day's business and sports.
La médina de Tripoli veut dire beaucoup pour les habitants.
Bienvenidos a las noticias de France 24.
Thanks very much for joining us.
أهلا بكم في ثقافة في عدد اليوم.
Ravi de vous retrouver pour Afrique Hebdo. Au programme cette semaine.
نسمع بين حين والآخر.
This storm has hit New York City a lot.
To be a president.
3, 2, 1.
Madagascar fait face à une seconde vague meurtrière.
Almost 99 million of you watch us every week. So thank you.
شكرا.
Gracias. Your confidence means a lot to us.
Muchas gracias.
شكرا على هذه الثقة.
Thank you.
Merci du fond de mon cœur.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Welcome back. You're watching France 24. Coming up, Russia claims the surrender of more than 1,000 Ukrainian Marines in Mariupol. Kyiv denies that claim. The city that's been surrounded for nearly 7 weeks. South Africa's president on hand after Durban's worst flooding in 6 decades. The death toll there climbing to 259. We'll cross live to correspondent Nadine Theron. In New York City, the manhunt for Tuesday's subway shooter. Police have identified 62-year-old Frank James as the sole suspect so far in the attack that took place in Brooklyn. Ukrainian authorities staunchly denying a report out of Moscow that more than 1,000 Marines have surrendered in the besieged port city of Mariupol. Mariupol that's been surrounded for 7 weeks. If the city does finally fall after a brutal bombing and shooting campaign, it would mean a land border between the Russian border and Crimea.
On Tuesday, the Russian army escorted journalists in the besieged port city of Mariupol, showing them the bombed-out ruins of the theater, where hundreds are believed to have been killed. It was the Russians' latest show of force in the city, where hope has all but died out. On Wednesday, the Russian forces said that more than 1,000 Ukrainian Marines had surrendered.
In the city of Mariupol and the area of the metallurgical plant Ilich, as a result of successful offensive operations of the Russian armed forces and units of the Donetsk People's Republic militia, 1,026 Ukrainian Marines voluntarily laid down their arms and surrendered.
The Ukrainian Defense Ministry says it has no knowledge about any surrender, and that Russian forces are continuing their attacks on Azovstal and the port area. But a Ukrainian presidential cabinet official recognized Tuesday that Ukrainian forces were surrounded and blocked in Mariupol. In his nightly address on Monday evening, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he believed Russia had killed at least tens of thousands of people in Mariupol. The city was once home to around 400,000 people, but many have fled. According to the Ukrainian authorities, tens of thousands of civilians remain trapped in the besieged port city.
If Mariupol does fall, it would be the first major city that the Russians would have captured. And as the shelling there continues, more bombing overnight in the last 24 hours, rather, in Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv. Local authorities say at least 7 killed and 22 wounded by shelling, including missiles that hit apartment, high-rise residential block, courtyards of the block covered with, as you can see, piles of debris. Over in Kyiv, the presidents of 4 neighboring countries paying a visit to show support for the country that's been invaded by Russia. The presidents of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia arriving by train to pay a call on Volodymyr Zelensky. In South Africa, the death tolls climbed to 259 from the devastating flooding that's hit the city of Durban. For more on that story, let's cross to correspondent Nadine Théron. Nadine, we're looking at those images of President Cyril Ramaphosa on hand. This is Durban's worst flooding in 6 decades.
Yes, and in fact, it's one of the worst weather disasters to have ever struck South Africa. As you know, more than 259 people have been reported dead, and the death toll is certainly said to rise in the coming days. Many bodies are still turning up in mortuaries, and many of those deaths have been children. The President Cyril Ramaphosa today visited affected communities, amongst them one family who lost 4 children when the wall of their house collapsed. This is the most rainfall that's ever been recorded by the South African Weather Services in the area. And it's not only the city of Durban. The affected area stretches about 200 kilometers from the north to the south of Durban. Around 6,000 houses have been swept away, with the informal communities and the poorest of the poor really being affected the worst. Many people don't have access to electricity. They don't even have access to water. They don't have mobile network reception either because of the damage to infrastructure. Of course, many businesses are closed and many banks are also closed. The president has promised these communities that the government will help them with water and food and shelter, and a lot of NGOs have also urged the South African public to help and donate. But the larger issue here is that this will affect the rest of the country, because the port of Durban is now closed and shipping has been suspended, and that's one of the most important, it is the most important harbor in southern Africa, and major trade routes are now closed because of the roads being affected, and goods can't be shipped or moved from the harbor to the rest of the country. Goods are being delayed, and many of the vehicles have just been stranded, and these are being looted. So it will definitely affect the rest of the country. And also a weather warning has now been issued for the neighboring province of the Eastern Cape, which might have flooding on the coming weekend. President Cyril Ramaphosa has blamed all of this on climate change, and experts have said this is because of the La Nina weather phenomenon.
Yeah, and it's ironic sitting where you are in Cape Town, where a few years ago it was a drought.
Yes, in fact, there are many areas that are experiencing flooding now have before suffered from drought. Areas in the Northern Cape and the Eastern Cape, just after the drought, they are now experiencing heavy rainfalls, and more heavy rainfall is expected on the weekend. So that's why the president said it's certainly climate change, and he has said that the local disaster risk management needs to be ramped up to deal with these kind of weather incidents, as climate change is now affecting South Africa directly.
Nadine, just one final question. You mentioned how it's affecting the poorest of the poor. When you have a natural disaster like this one, it highlights the endemic problem South Africa has with housing.
Yes, of course, and that's why 6,000 houses have been swept away, because these houses are not built with bricks. They are informal houses built of rubble and aluminium and stuff. So that's why they've been easy to be swept away. They don't have proper foundations, and they're in low-lying areas where rivers often flood. So that's why thousands and thousands of people are now displaced. Many of these people were just starting to rebuild their lives following the riots of July last year, that also brought that very city to its knees. So this is very terrible, only a few months later, to again affect the people of Durban.
Nadine Theron reporting from South Africa. Many thanks for that update. Ivory Coast's Prime Minister has resigned, Patrick Achi. It's unclear whether he'll be named again by President Alassane Ouattara to form the next government. The government saying that it intends on a scaled-down cabinet next time around. In New York City, the manhunt continues after Tuesday morning's rush hour shooting in the subway in Brooklyn. A suspect now has come to light. 62-year-old Frank James, who posted hostile messages on social media and is believed to have rented a van that was left near the scene of that shooting. Earlier, we spoke with correspondent Jessica Le Mazurier.
The search for the gunman who set off smoke bombs and sprayed passengers on board a New York City subway car with bullets continues this Wednesday. Frank R. James, the man who was previously identified as a person of interest, is now being considered as a suspect, according to New York police. They've offered a $50,000 reward to anyone who can lead them to him. James was first linked to the shooting after police found keys to a rented U-Haul van at the scene of the crime. They found that van parked on a Brooklyn street and traced it to James. Now, police say that James has addresses in Philadelphia and Wisconsin. He was apparently known to the FBI and had posted unhinged video rants online. In one of them, he talks about New York Mayor Eric Adams, saying that at one point he was, quote, a victim of Adams's mental health policies. Now, New York City has seen a sharp rise in violent crime and a string of seemingly random attacks on its subways. The response from New York's mayor has been to beef up policing, but civil society activists argue that really the root causes of the problem ought to be treated, and those include poverty, inequality, a lack of proper medical care, including, perhaps most importantly, a lack of proper mental health care services for those with psychiatric disorders.
Jessica Le Mazurier. Later in the France 24 debate, how Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen's world views are radically different. We'll be talking about foreign policy 11 days before the French presidential election. Now, ahead of the second round, there is a swing state, or rather a swing constituency. The far left's Jean-Luc Mélenchon finished a strong second, almost leapfrogging Le Pen to make the runoff. Delano de Souza has more on how the candidates are trying to court his voters.
He came in third place in Sunday's election, and now supporters of Jean-Luc Mélenchon are being courted by the presidential frontrunners in France, something that's easier said than done.
My vote should go to someone I really believe in. In this case, neither Macron nor Marine Le Pen have convinced me.
Jean-Luc Mélenchon told his supporters not to vote for Marine Le Pen, but stopped short of endorsing Emmanuel Macron. His supporters say they aren't ready to give the current president a free pass.
It would pain me to vote for him, but it would pain me more to vote for Le Pen. So yes, things are complex.
Jean-Luc Mélenchon took home 22% of Sunday's vote and scored well with urban, college-educated voters.
In our masters, we spoke a lot about politics. There was no better choice for the youth, for society, for the environment, or finance. We had a program which was solid.
Mélenchon came in 1.2% behind Marine Le Pen in the first round, and supporters of the 70-year-old say they're disappointed after coming so close.
Voting Jean-Luc Mélenchon would have meant changing up the system somewhere. And now we won't change. We find ourselves in the same situation we did 5 years ago.
Do you not see yourself voting for Macron?
I'm not sure yet.
And Marine Le Pen?
Her neither.
Will you abstain?
Maybe I'll just go fishing or cast a blank vote.
With days to go until the second round of the presidential election, a sizable chunk of Mélenchon supporters say they're likely to cast a blank ballot or abstain.
Time now for business, and we say hello to Brian Quinn.
Hey, Francois.
We are watching what's going on in Brussels with talk of a full embargo on Russian oil and perhaps eventually even Russian gas. The Germans have been crunching the numbers. They're worried.
Not so keen on it for the moment. German government says it has ruled out supporting an EU-wide ban on Russian oil and gas for now. That's because its leading economic institutes believe a sudden halt of energy imports from Russia would trigger a major recession, including a 1.9% pullback this year and a 3.1% contraction in 2023. The institutes say the war in Ukraine is already reducing both supply and demand, though they do still expect the German economy to grow by 2.7% this year and 3.1% next year, as long as the gas stays on. Now, German industry is heavily reliant on Russian energy to power its factories. A consortium of economic think tanks says a supply freeze would cost the national economy around 220 billion euros worth of output. Take a listen here.
The imminent interruption of natural gas and oil supplies from Russia to the European Union naturally represents a particular risk for this economic forecast. The institutes are therefore focused on an alternative scenario, assuming supplies will be stopped immediately. In this case, the German economy is likely to fall into a severe recession in the coming year.
The U.S., Canada, Britain, and Australia have already banned imports of Russian oil in response to the war in Ukraine. The supply disruption is one major factor in skyrocketing global energy prices. Western financial sanctions, meanwhile, have severely complicated Russia's ability to pay its foreign debt. They also initially took a big bite out of the ruble before Russian capital controls and interest rate hikes helped it to recover most of its pre-war value. Many commodities traders, though, are wary of sanctions, have been voluntarily avoiding Russian crude oil. Moscow says it's ready to both boost domestic energy consumption and to sell energy products to friendly countries in any price range. Here's President Vladimir Putin on that on Wednesday.
Undoubtedly, we are facing problems, but this opens up new possibilities. When it comes to Russian oil, gas, and coal, we will be able to increase their consumption on the domestic market and stimulate the processing of raw materials. We will also increase the supply of energy resources to other regions of the world where they are really needed.
New figures out Tuesday saw U.S. consumer inflation hit its highest rate in 4 decades. Prices in March up 8.5% there compared to a year earlier. Wednesday brought the latest UK data. Inflation there is now at a 3-decade high. Prices in March are up 7% from a year ago, higher than both predictions of 6.7% as well as February's rate of 6.2%. Those figures do not take into account a £700 increase in the country's annual energy price cap. Average UK gasoline prices, meanwhile, rose nearly 13 cents per litre from February to March. That data weighing on European stock markets as investors expect inflation to trigger tighter monetary policy from central banks. Here in Europe, London's FTSE 100 ending the day nearly flat amid expectations that higher producer costs will take a bite out of profits. The CAC 40 here in Paris not too much higher as the Frankfurt DAX ends the day down around 1/3%. Wall Street, though, gaining ground as corporate earnings season kicks off with mostly good news. A big profit slump at JP Morgan, one of the major exceptions there. The travel and tech sectors, though, advancing with the tech-heavy NASDAQ up nearly 1 3/4% at midday in New York. Finally, for business, Western economies are far from the only ones feeling the pain of rising prices. Asia, too, is in the midst of an inflationary bout. Though it's slower than the OECD average of 7.7%, consumers and businesses are still being pinched. Catherine Viet has the details.
Made of fermented cabbage, it's a staple of Korean cuisine. But now buying kimchi costs more. In South Korea, the consumer price index for March rose just over 4% from a year earlier, hitting a decade high.
Prices of ingredients have all gone up. However, I'm selling it at the same price. If it goes on like this, I won't be able to stay in business.
In Japan, consumer prices in the capital have risen at their fastest pace in more than 2 years, due in part to record-high energy costs caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This restaurant owner in Tokyo says he had to increase the price of his noodles by 14% to compensate for the higher cost of ingredients, including for cooking oil, which has doubled compared to last year.
Our udon dishes were not that expensive to start with, like 2 to 3 euros. So a 40-cent increase is really huge. But I have no choice but to increase the price in order to continue what I want to do.
In Singapore, which imports 90% of its food, it's a similar story. Inflation has risen at its fastest pace in 9 years, with the government expecting it to increase around 3% this year. Rising energy prices due to the war in Ukraine and continued global supply chain snarls dating back to the pandemic are driving the price hikes. The increases are squeezing businesses and consumers alike as shopkeepers fret over raising prices or losing customers, and customers cut back on eating out as they tighten their budgets.
Everything's getting more expensive, Francois. It makes me want to go back to an izakaya, though. That was pretty good. Take a bite of that.
It's dinner time in Paris, as you can see. Many thanks, Brian Quinn. We'll have more business news for you later. It's time now for sports. We say hello to Jean-Emile Jamin, who's relishing another night of quarterfinal action in the Champions League.
Yes, Francois. Well, if it's anything to go by last night, well, we hope for another spectacle this evening. It obviously all depends on which Atletico Madrid team turn up against Manchester City. Of course, they face the Premier League leaders, and the Manchester City team, they hold a 1-goal slender advantage from that first leg, in which they absolutely dominated the men from Spain, so much so that Diego Simeone's team couldn't even muster a single shot throughout that entire 90 minutes. But the question on everyone's lips, including a City boss Pep Guardiola's, is will that victory be enough? The Colchoneros have progressed on 2 of the last 3 previous occasions. They've lost the first leg of a Champions League knockout tie, and Argentine coach Simeone, he says he's confident that they can turn things around.
Clearly, we will not be doing things very differently, trying to find the right times to create what we want. Hopefully we can combine better, to have faster transitions and be able to take advantage of the counterattacks we have with more accuracy. And we hope our players with the most experience have a great night. From there, we'll try to push within the game with motivation in the different moments of the game. Anything can happen in one match.
Well, that's, of course, the first game. It would be a bigger shock tonight if Benfica could overturn a 3-1 deficit to beat Liverpool at Anfield and knock them out at the quarterfinal stage. The Reds are a dominant force under Jurgen Klopp and were clinical at the Estadio de Luz, scoring through Ibrahima Konate, Sadio Mane and Luis Diaz. Darwin Núñez then in response for the team from Portugal. But one more Benfica goal could give enough hope to turn the tie completely around, according to coach Nelson Verissimo.
We will have our moments. We have an opportunity, a chance. We know we will have to maintain our composure and be consistent. We have prepared for that, and I'm sure that even though it will be difficult, we will go there with the ambition and hope that we can do it.
So just a reminder there of what to expect tonight as Manchester City travel to Atletico de Madrid, hoping to stave off any comeback, while Liverpool host Benfica, with the Reds holding a commanding lead from that first leg in Portugal. And looking back, of course, the winners of that match in Madrid will face Real in the semi-finals after Karim Benzema's heroics on Tuesday evening knocked out a resilient Chelsea team. Thomas Tuchel's men just unable to complete an epic comeback at the Bernabeu, and then the winner of Liverpool-Benfica face off against the much unfancied Villarreal after Unai Emery's team stunned Bayern Munich, winning 2-1 on aggregate to dump Julian Nagelsmann's team out of the competition. So some very exciting games to look forward to then. Well, it's been just 2 months since the shock departure of Justin Langer as Australia's national cricket coach. But finally, the country's top cricketing body has appointed Andrew MacDonald to take over the reins. The 40-year-old secured a 4-year contract after winning praise for his performance as interim coach since Langer's departure on the 5th of February. MacDonald takes over one of the highest profile jobs in Australia, but he'll be riding on a high note of confidence after a successful tour of Pakistan, where his team won the Test Series and Seoul T20. ODI captain Aaron Finch has already praised MacDonald for his calm approach, standing in stark contrast to Langer, who was publicly called out even by Test captain Pat Cummins for his extreme coaching methods. Well, now there were bowed heads and a minute of silence was held before the basketball game between the Brooklyn Nets and Cleveland Cavaliers on Tuesday night, as everyone in the Barclays Center paid tribute to those caught up in the New York subway attacks on Tuesday. There was a game to be played, however, and it was the Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant show, scoring 34 and 25 points apiece. And that helped the Nets win the game 115 points to 108, taking the number 7 seed in the Eastern Conference. The team from Brooklyn raced to a 20-point lead after one quarter and turned the Cavaliers away time and time again to earn a matchup with number 2 seed Boston in a series that begins on Sunday. Darius Garland, meanwhile, scored 34 points for the Cavaliers, who have another chance to earn that number 8 seed. And finally, records are there to be broken, and that's exactly what Kate Jaden has done. The British endurance athlete has eviscerated a world record by becoming the first female runner to complete 100 marathons in 100 consecutive days, a total distance of 4,216 kilometers. The 35-year-old from Derbyshire undertook the challenge to illustrate the distance a Syrian refugee has to travel to get to the UK. Kate began her challenge in January and finished at the Brighton Marathon on Sunday, helping raise over £32,000 for charities in the process. Here she is describing the inspiration behind her efforts.
And I think, I've been asked quite a few times, did you ever think about chucking the towel in? And the reality was, how could I even dream of doing that? Because a refugee goes through this journey in real life, in real time, through real arduous conditions. Don't let anybody ever tell you that you can't make a difference. Because the number of times people have said there's no point because you're not going to make a difference. But you can.
Francois, an important message there. Don't let anyone tell you what you can and can't do to make a difference.
My bones ache just listening to that story. But anyway, bravo to Kate. Many thanks for that. Jean-Emile Jamin will have more sports news, including those Champions League results for you later. Coming up at the top of the hour, more news than the France 24 debate. 11 days to go till the French presidential election. And as you will see, radically different viewpoints when it comes to France's place on the world stage from Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen. That's coming up in the France 24 debate.
They observe. They contact us. They report, film, photograph. They are the voice of the voiceless. Your eyes in the far-flung reaches of the world. The Observers, a network of 5,000 committed citizens working with France 24.
One of our observers in Côte d'Ivoire, Gaspard.
Amateur footage and testimonials checked by our journalists and broadcast weekly on The Observers, on France 24 and observers.france24.com. They're known for their cuisine and saying hello with a kiss. They only work 35 hours per week, when they're not on strike, that is. How true are these clichés about France? Every week, Florence Villeminot tears apart stereotypes. Join us for insight into French culture and current events to understand what makes the French so unique.
French Connections, presented by Florence Villeminot on France 24 and France24.com. Fake news. Noun. False stories that appear to be news, spread on the internet or using other media. At France 24, our job is to provide you with information that's been verified. We check sources, we check facts, we sort what is true from what is fake.
At the France 24 Observers, we verify photos and videos circulating online. If they're fake, we let you know and tell you how we spotted them.
In Fact or Fake, we dig into viral stories around Europe to shake out the truth from the trash.
Every day, the Info Migrants team scours social networks to fight fake news about the reality of migration.
France 24, news based on facts.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
I'm Gulliver Cragg, France 24's correspondent in Kiev. I'm forever crisscrossing Ukraine, Poland and other countries in the region to keep you up to date with all the news from Central and Eastern Europe. Join me on Live from Paris and in all France 24's news and magazine programmes.
Gulliver Cragg, one of the 200 France 24 correspondents around the world.
Welcome back. You're watching France 24. Coming up, Russia claims the surrender of more than 1,000 Ukrainian Marines in Mariupol, the bombed-out port city that's been surrounded for nearly 7 weeks. Kyiv denies. Less NATO, more distance with Germany. French far-right candidate Marine Le Pen spells out her vision on foreign policy. This after a day earlier, Emmanuel Macron warned of her hidden project to leave the EU. South Africa's president on hand after Durban's worst flooding in 6 decades, the death toll there climbing to 259. After the news, the France 24 debate, it's not just this country holding its breath. Europe and NATO waiting on the winner of the April 24th French presidential runoff. Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen diametrically opposed on everything from how to handle Vladimir Putin to the relations with Germany and the EU. Tell us what you think on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. Ukraine denies Moscow's claim that more than 1,000 Marines have surrendered in the besieged port city of Mariupol. After weeks of a brutal siege, Russian forces close to securing a land bridge between Crimea and the Russian border. Back in Kyiv, authorities say they're bracing for an all-out onslaught further north in the Donbass. Earlier, we spoke with Chief International Affairs Editor Robert Parsons.
Russians are building up their strength in the Donbass area. They're trying to press down from the town of Izium, which is between the Donbass and Kharkiv in the north on the Russian border, which has been under attack throughout this war so far for the last 6 weeks. And then there's the fighting that you refer to in the introduction, Mariupol, with that report made by the Russians that 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers from the 36th Marines had surrendered. That is categorically denied by the Ukrainian authorities. And certainly the Azov regiment inside Mariupol is continuing to fight. And President Zelensky is still calling for heavy weaponry, in part so that the Ukrainian army can make an effort to break into Mariupol and relieve the troops in the city.
Robert Parsons reporting there. Ukrainian authorities say that they were able to intercept businessman Viktor Medvedchuk while trying to flee to Transnistria. And meanwhile, the Kremlin rejecting the idea of a prisoner exchange when it comes to this controversial ally of the Kremlin. Selena Sykes has more.
A close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin captured by Ukrainian authorities. Viktor Medvedchuk had been in hiding since escaping house arrest in Ukraine during the first few days of Russia's invasion. Ukraine's security service announced his capture in a statement late on Tuesday in a special operation praised by President Volodymyr Zelensky.
I find it particularly cynical of him to disguise himself as a soldier. What a soldier, what a patriot. Well, if Medvedchuk chose to wear a military uniform, he falls under the rules of wartime. I propose to Russia that we exchange this guy for yours, for our people, who are now in Russian captivity.
Medvedchuk is a close friend of Putin. The Russian president is the godfather of one of his daughters. The Ukrainian oligarch led the pro-Kremlin party Opposition Platform for Life, which aimed to steer the country away from the West. The 67-year-old is one of several pro-Moscow politicians accused of involvement in a plot unveiled by the US to set up a pro-Kremlin collaborative government ahead of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since his surprise election in 2019, President Zelensky has been leading a crackdown on Medvedchuk. In February last year, 3 pro-Russian TV channels widely believed to be owned by the tycoon were taken off air. Zelensky said it was a necessary move in the fight against Russian propaganda. Medvedchuk was later charged with treason, accused of selling military secrets to Moscow and exploiting Crimea's natural resources under Russia's occupation. His political party was swiftly suspended after the Russian invasion. Moscow has refused to comment on his detention.
Marine Le Pen staging a press conference on her future relations abroad if she's elected French president on April the 24th. Relations with Russia, one of the keys, she says that once the fighting is over, that France will have to deal with Moscow. The far-right candidate who also poured doubt over the future of the so-called Franco-German motor when it comes to EU relations.
Germany therefore presents itself as the absolute opposite of France's strategic identity, which is based on independence, deterrence, and a world-class military and industrial model. Taking all these fundamental differences into account, these are reconcilable strategic differences. We will end all military cooperation with Berlin, with jet fighters and next-generation tanks, to pursue our own upgrade program of Rafale jets and Leclerc tanks.
South Africa is reeling from Durban's worst floods in 6 decades. President Cyril Ramaphosa on hand to comfort families of the victims. Some 259 killed, according to the latest toll, but there are still many that are missing, and worries about the flooding moving towards the Cape region.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa was in the coastal city of Durban today, promising the government would spare no effort in dealing with the disaster. Search and rescue operations continued on Wednesday. More than 200 people have died, and many are still missing.
What is very difficult is that we have lost the lives of many people, and their houses have been washed out. The roads have also been washed out, as well as the bridges. We thought we should come here so that we could see for ourselves.
All across the KwaZulu-Natal province, floods wreaked havoc and devastation on Tuesday. Entire roads and highways were destroyed, and thousands of homes were damaged. Several power stations were affected, cutting off electricity in parts of the region. Hundreds of residents are now stranded, as they were unable to reach an overwhelmed emergency call center. Those who made it out say they've lost everything.
I got nowhere to go now. I got no house, I got no nothing. The situation is very, very bad. I don't know where we're going to sleep now.
Regional authorities have urged people residing in low-lying areas to move to higher ground, as more rainfall was expected in the coming days.
And meanwhile, the flooding is bad as well in the Philippines. Tropical storms starting earlier than usual, with many blaming climate change. At least 67 killed, 28 others reported missing after a tropical depression unleashed days of rain in the center and south of the country. In Hong Kong, after the resignation of Carrie Lam, her potential successor has now officially thrown his hat in the ring. John Lee is the city's outgoing deputy leader and who's got the backing of Beijing. Monty Francis has that story.
He is Hong Kong's leader in waiting. John Lee, who served as second in charge, is now making a bid to become the next chief executive of the semi-autonomous Chinese territory. Lee is the only candidate in the race, but insists it won't be an easy campaign.
It is not easy because I have been working very hard to explain to various members what my election platforms will be like.
The 64-year-old would replace Carrie Lam, who announced last week that she would not seek a second term. A former police officer and head of security, he oversaw the enforcement of Beijing's national security law imposed in 2020, which led to widespread pro-democracy protests. As chief executive, Lee is expected to prioritize security issues and has warned about lingering underground terrorist and independence movements. If confirmed as the head of the territory, Lee would take office on July 1st, the day marking the 25th anniversary of the handover of the former British colony to the People's Republic of China.
We have more news coming up, but stay with us because coming up next, it's the France 24 debate. How does candidate Macron fare on foreign policy versus candidate Le Pen? That's coming up next in the France 24 debate.
France 24, your window on the world.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
They're watching what French voters will be deciding on April 24th, well beyond our borders. Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen serving up opposing visions of France's place on the world stage. He's for ratcheting up concerted EU sanctions against Vladimir Putin. She's against any oil or gas embargo. The incumbent backs banding together on defense and military. His far-right rival wants France to quit NATO's integrated military command. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, who's the right candidate for this moment? It's cost of living, not foreign policy, that's top of voters' minds. But those price hikes aren't happening in a vacuum. What lessons drawn from the global scramble unfolding for goods and raw materials and the overdependence on Russian oil and gas? Is France better off bargaining on its own or as part of a broader EU on energy, healthcare, immigration? Today in the France 24 debate, two candidates that are a world apart. Joining us, French member of Parliament Anne Genté from Emmanuel Macron's La République En Marche party. Thanks for being with us.
Good evening.
Bruno Gollnisch, former member of the European Parliament for Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening as well to Julien Théron, Professor of International Security Studies at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Nice to see you.
Hi.
And while the French campaign, the fate of another European country is in the balance. Joining us from Kyiv, Peter Zalmayev, Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Thank you for joining us.
Greetings.
The France 24 debate where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, #F24debate. So one day after Emmanuel Macron accused his rival of having a hidden agenda of quitting the EU entirely, Marine Le Pen staging a 90-minute press conference in which she spelled out her views on foreign policy. Emerald Maxwell has more.
Marine Le Pen's professed admiration for Russian President Vladimir Putin is well known. But this press conference was her chance to pitch the rest of her foreign policy. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, the far-right presidential candidate claims to have partly changed her opinion about the Russian leader. But at the Wednesday presser, she said she still backs closer ties between NATO and Moscow.
As soon as the Russia-Ukraine war is over and we have a peace treaty, I will propose a strategic rapprochement between NATO and Russia.
Le Pen added that she wants to pull out of NATO's joint military command in the name of independence and military sovereignty. She also wants to put an end to all joint military programs with Germany, citing their strategic differences. Although no longer an outright supporter of Frexit or ditching the euro, Le Pen is still critical of the constraints of EU law and favours a looser version of the Union. It's a far cry from Emmanuel Macron's openly pro-European position. The incumbent advocates for a strong EU, arguing that everything must be done to ensure that it's autonomous in terms of energy and military capabilities.
The battle we're waging is not simply a battle for France. It's a battle for Europe, because the far-right project in front of us is against the project I'm defending on behalf of many of you here. It's a hidden project, but now it's more ambiguous. But it is a project to leave Europe.
After calling NATO brain dead in 2019, Emmanuel Macron is now urging the North Atlantic Alliance to unify in the face of a war on Europe's doorstep. He's also led the charge in getting the EU to impose strict sanctions against Moscow. At a time of crisis, the president's main foreign policy pitch to voters is steady leadership.
Bruno Gollnisch, lots of points in there to go over. Let's start with Marine Le Pen's proposal for a rapprochement once the war is over between Russia and Ukraine. Is that possible if Vladimir Putin is still the president?
Well, if there is a peace treaty, yes, I suppose. But anyway, Mr. Putin will not stay in office for decades, I guess. So the problem is not the relationship with Mr. Putin. The problem is the relationship with Russia. And I don't see why we should behave differently from what we did, for example, with Germany after World War I and World War II. And now we have a good relationship with Germany, and also we want to have we have some differences, but we have a good relationship with Germany. So I hope we will have a good relationship one day with Russia, because Russia is part of our world and civilization. And by the way, if what Jean-Marie Le Pen himself and Marine Le Pen and myself were advocated, I think maybe this war would never have happened.
And Gente?
Of course, I strongly disagree with that. You have to say here that we have two visions between Mrs. Le Pen and Mr. Macron about international relations and about the relation to Russia. Yes, indeed, we are not at war with Mr. Putin, definitely not. With Russia, sorry, definitely not. But Putin is clearly a problem. But I noticed that Mrs. Le Pen doesn't say a word about how we can reach a treaty. We are not talking for the moment about a treaty. We are talking about a war that was declared, and the aggressor was Mr. Putin and the Russian forces against Ukraine, and she doesn't say a word. And when you are a leader, you need also to address the problem of how you can get out of the situation where we are in now, and she doesn't say a word about it.
But first of all, she is not in charge. Second,
it's 2 weeks from now.
Second, Mr. Macron is in charge and doesn't succeed in getting peace and between Ukraine and Russia. And third, it's not Marine Le Pen who can say exactly what could be an agreement or a treaty of peace between these two countries. She has no possibility to talk on behalf of the Ukrainian government, for example, nor of the Russian government.
Julien Théron, at that press conference, Marine Le Pen saying that she now is in favor of defensive weapons shipments and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Has she changed her stance?
Yes. Yes, definitely. I remember some days where Marine Le Pen was saying that she was wanting to put France right in the middle between the US and Russia, equating on one side the American democracy and what everybody is agreeing today, even her, as the Russian dictatorship. So yes, I think that there was an adaptation of her position. Yes.
No, but it was. Excuse me, sir, but it was before the war broke.
It's exactly
so
what
there is no
saying.
change. She from the very beginning of this war, she very clearly stated that she considered, and we all consider, that Russia led the aggression against Ukraine.
So sorry about that.
This is an adaptation.
Crystal
May
clear.
I add,
there is no adaptation at all.
May I add that in the European Parliament, the members of the European Parliament from her party have voted against or have abstained from voting any support to Ukraine. And this was after the war started.
Peter Zamayev, sitting in Kyiv, what was your reaction when you heard the words of Marine Le Pen?
Well, on the surface of it, you may be, excused for feeling encouraged by what you heard from someone who has received $10 million loan from a Russian bank. Mind you, this was almost immediately after Russia invaded the Crimea, and from someone who has said that she respects Vladimir Putin because he defends the interests of Russia. I'm quoting her verbatim. So obviously, we are seeing her reposition herself in order to be more competitive with her rival, President Macron. But I think what Vladimir Putin is after is not, to have European leaders pledge their fealty, their loyalty to him. He does not need that. He understands that they will not be able to win outright elections this way. What he's after with politicians like in France, which is a major component of the European Union, is someone who would gravitate away from a transatlantic unity, such as Mrs. Le Pen has agitated for all her career, someone who would consider probably splitting from NATO, weakening the European Union, and then obviously talking about how an oil and gas embargo against Russia would not be in the interests of French voters. That is precisely what Vladimir Putin is after. He doesn't care if they do or do not support sanctions against him at this point. The oil embargo is really where it hurts Vladimir Putin. And as long as she's saying that they will not support oil embargo, Vladimir Putin is very happy with it.
Yes. Well, Mr. Almayev is advocating oil and gas embargo, as far as I understand, but maybe he just forgets that Russian gas is still crossing Ukraine before arriving to Germany. And I think if there should be gas, if you want a gas embargo with Russia, it's very simple. The Ukraine has to cut gas embargo. I perfectly understand that in these terrible circumstances, the Ukrainian government cannot do so because it is one of the main resources. And secondly, about this famous loan. This loan, Mrs. Le Pen didn't get a single penny from the Russian government. This loan was much before
it's from 2014.
Russian aggression against Ukraine.
And she's still paying it back. The optics are bad. You'll agree with that. You'll agree that the optics are bad on that.
Sorry?
Loan. You'll agree that the optics are bad. It's a loan from 2014.
Yes.
And she's still paying it back today.
She's still paying back. It's not a gift. It's not a gift. And why?
But does it make her beholden to Russia? Does it make her beholden to Russia? That's the question.
No. When you are indebted to somebody, you have to fulfill your commitment and repay. She sticks on the contract with this. By the way, it was a Czech-Russian bank. But why did she had recourse to this bank? It's because first, because no French bank wanted to loan her a single penny. And secondly, because Mr. Macron did not fulfill his promise to have a special bank called Bank of Democracy, precisely to help the political parties to come for campaigning.
The loan was from 2014, and the Bank for Democracy, the promise was from 2017.
But this promise is not fulfilled yet. We are still waiting for this promise.
Julien Théron, is it a question of national security almost, this issue of this loan? And is it a problem? Is Bruno Gollnisch right? Is there campaign finance reform, which is perhaps a domestic issue, we're straying a little from foreign policy?
Well, it's true that she went to this bank because she was not having some money from French banks. Although we can recall as well that it was not very different in time, the position of Marine Le Pen wanting to recognize the admission of Crimea after the invasion of Russia, already a first invasion of Ukraine. Because at this time, we had this narrative that there was this referendum and so on. But Vladimir Putin himself said live on the telly that it was obviously Russian soldiers over there. So it was a first invasion of Russia. So when we speak about the war in Ukraine, we speak about 2022. It started in 2014. It's the third invasion of Ukraine. Even in Donbass, it has been said plenty of time. I have civil sources, official sources, who confirmed that the Russian forces were in Donbass, conventional forces. So it's just the third episode of Russian aggression on Ukraine. 2014 was already an invasion of Russia in its neighboring country.
Well, but the fact that Crimea has been completely artificially
it has been invaded by Russian forces. Vladimir Putin said it.
Ukraine, as you may know, it's Khrushchev who gave Crimea to.
Right, but wouldn't it have been better to have first a referendum and then send soldiers?
But anyway, if Mrs. Le Pen was that much indebted to Mr. Putin, she wouldn't have condemned clearly the aggression against Ukraine.
In 2022, not in 2014.
Not in 2014.
Peter Zalmayev, again, this question of when you look at countries in Western Europe and how they view what's happened over the last 8 years in Ukraine, what's your view right now? How much has it changed?
Well, I think this is finally a wake-up call for Western societies, for Western countries. We still have recalcitrant members the European Union, such as obviously Mr. Orban of Hungary, who is a definite outlier. Germany is still kind of wobbling. But overall, I think there is a nascent kind of understanding that Vladimir Putin, contrary to what the previous speaker said, maybe he misspoke, maybe he meant it in a different way. But when he said that Russia is part of our world, that's one thing. But to say that Russia is part of our civilization, I would probably not agree with that. Russia is definitely not a European power anymore. He has made it very clear. Trying to deal with Vladimir Putin as a reasonable kind of political actor is very, very naive. The bloody massacres that the world has seen in Borodyanka, in Bucha, has exposed to the world the very plain fact that what we're dealing with right now is a 21st century Adolf Hitler. Just because the Russians are claiming they're fighting some neo-Nazis in Ukraine does not mean that they cannot be themselves Nazis. As Churchill has said, Winston Churchill, tomorrow's fascists will be calling themselves anti-fascists. We need to understand that there's no business as usual with Russia. Russia cannot declare any sort of victory in Ukraine. It must go.
All right, you mentioned Hungary there. Eyebrows were raised when Marine Le Pen turned this time around to a Hungarian bank, MKB, to finance her campaign to the tune of 10.6 million euros. Hungary, which continues to defy EU and Council of Europe norms over rule of law, and whose prime minister received a warm message of congratulations for his April 3rd general election win. This is a tweet from Marine Le Pen where she states in it, congratulations to Viktor Orban for his landslide victory in Hungary's legislative elections. When the people vote, the people win. When answering a heckler on a campaign stop Tuesday in Strasbourg, her rival, incumbent President Emmanuel Macron, called out her warm relations with Orban.
You can cry out and even say things like, "Down with the Republic," which in my view is an absurdity. But you can do it. That's the difference between living in France and living in Hungary.
So, Anjanti, do you paint Viktor Orban with the same brush as Vladimir Putin right now?
I just noticed that beyond the problem of the loans, Mrs. Le Pen just admires Mr. Putin or Mr. Orban. Both of them are men. She admires them for the fact that they are very strong in their country, very tough in their country, but also these are men who have changed their own constitutions. They have decided to reduce the freedom of speech, reduce the freedom of the press, and reduce some basic laws for freedom. So here we can see that Mrs. Le Pen admires those who reduces our own liberties or on freedom. So when she says that she wants to fight for more freedom in our country, I strongly disagree with that. She has hidden words and hidden agenda in which she says, through the admiration of Mr. Putin on the one hand, of Mr. Orban on the other hand, that she will very probably she will have a change, very probably the French constitution, and she could be someone who could reduce also, and she has mentioned yesterday about the press, how she could choose which press she would be talking to. This should be something against which we should all fight.
Would Marine Le Pen govern like Viktor Orban governs Hungary?
What will be sure that Marine Le Pen will defend the freedom of French people, the identity of French people, and there's no hidden agenda at all. What we have been advocating for past decades within the European Parliament is quite clear. We don't want that an European superstate imposes on us our way of life, or so-called European values. I still wonder what these values are exactly. I defend the true values of European civilization, which is the part where have been invented, very tiny part in the world, that invented the freedom and equality of nations. And we agree for cooperation among European nations. We agree for free trade between European nations, or roughly the same level of life, the same burden of taxes, the same social welfare. But we don't want unfair competition from other countries. We don't want massive immigration without being able refuse it. It's clear. The problem between Mr. Macron, the challenge between Mr. Macron and Mrs. Le Pen, it's between globalism on one side and defense of national identity and freedom on the other.
Angente?
Okay, if I may say, we see here through your words that for Mrs. Le Pen, European is a problem. But for Mr. Macron, European is the solution. He strongly defends the fact that having a very strong and independent and sovereign Europe makes a very strong and independent and sovereign France. This is the solution and the path where we should go. This is what he has been defending for the past 5 years with quite a great success. When we see what we have reached out with the vaccine that we have purchased together, the anti-COVID vaccines, with the fact that now Europe has decided within a couple of days to have grant and loans for the plan for the recovery plan. After the COVID situation, and now through the defense, the European defense, which is something he has been talking about since 2018, and many European countries were quite reluctant to this, and now through the war in Ukraine, we have understood that European defense, together with the NATO alliance, is the solution to have an independence.
Peter Zamayev, Ukraine knocking on the door vociferously to join the European Union. Is it only about protection from Russia?
Well, it's not just protection about Russia. It's encouraging a country that has really set, I think, has set an example for Europeans what it means to want to be a European. I think there's been a little slackening of enthusiasm over the common European project on the part of Europeans themselves. Ukraine has been showing by example, by spilling its blood, that it wants to be a part of the Western civilization. It is going to be I think a step of immense symbolism right now for the European Union to welcome Ukraine as a member. The first step has already been made. Ukraine has been welcomed as a candidate. I think it sends a very strong signal, not just to Ukrainians, but to the Russians. And that's why I think Vladimir Putin resents Ukraine. It's because he knows
sorry, Peter,
sooner or later, Ukraine will join Europe and will gravitate away from Russia.
So we heard Bruno Gollnisch express his definition of what a European civilization is, nations that are equal amongst each other. What's your definition of European civilization?
My definition of European civilization is obviously rule of law. It is, the ability of, each individual to choose his or her, way of life. Is a freedom of assembly. It's a freedom to worship whatever, God you want to worship, something that Russia, and a freedom obviously to express your opinion, something we see less and less and less of in Ukraine, in Russia, I'm sorry. Let me just end by saying, by sending a cautionary kind of a signal, a cautionary tale, which is Turkey. By playing around with Turkey for so long, the European Union, by promising its membership and then sort of not denying it membership, look where it's got. Turkey has become ever more authoritarian. And so you have to be, I think Europeans have to be very, very careful not to repeat that, precedent. Ukraine now is setting the trend, as you know, in the world. It has probably the world's strongest army as far as the will to fight. I think Europe wants Ukraine as a member.
Julien Théron?
Yes, well, I think that the Europeans absolutely know what is the European Union precisely because they fought for it. This is actually the only country where there has been a pro-EU revolution in 2013-14 with the Euromaidan. As you might remember, the whole story of what is happening to Ukraine is actually coming from the project of the Ukrainian president aligned on Moscow, wanting not to have any more relations with the EU, but to join the Eurasian Economic Union, which was just created by Vladimir Putin. The population demonstrated against this project. It became extremely violent with the Berkut and Oman, the security forces over there. And even the president at the end made a shot on the people. When in Moscow they said, oh, look, it's the CIA to accuse Russia of doing so. The President Yanukovych fled since then to Russia. And the Ukrainians wanted to go toward Europe. That's what happened. And that's why Vladimir Putin started his whole campaign against a country, because Ukraine is not Russia, but it's very close. And Vladimir Putin has... Well, he criticized corruption in Ukraine, but the corruption rate in Russia is worse than in Ukraine. And the development index in Russia is worse than in the EU. You live 10 years less in Russia than in the EU. And the Ukrainians are absolutely knowledgeable of that. And they fought for that. They have the intention to go on the West because it's basically the interest. Our guest spoke about, indeed, the rule of law, anti-corruption, guarantees of democracy, horizontal powers, freedom of the press, and that does not exist in Russia. And Russia's interest is just to dominate Ukraine as it dominates Russia itself. And that's the Kremlin's project. Ukrainians don't want to be free among equal precisely inside the EU.
Bruno Gollnisch?
Well, I do not involve in Ukrainian politics unless the sympathy I express for the Ukrainian people because of the suffering from the Russian aggression. But it seems to me that either right or wrong, I will not decide it myself. Maidan events were a coup d'etat against an elected president.
That's what says Vladimir Putin.
Sorry?
That's the narrative of Vladimir Putin.
No, it's a matter of fact. There was an elected president that has been chased.
Ukrainian people.
But you decide.
I don't decide.
You decide
who. People. I was in Ukraine.
What is the will of Ukrainian people? The fact that the president.
I was in Ukraine.
The fact is that the president that had been kicked out had been a rightfully elected president. That's all.
Peter Zamayev.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to ask the previous colleague what he would consider the French Revolution. Was that a coup d'état? You know,
yes, it was certainly. Yes.
It was a legal coup d'état, right?
Yes, it was.
And
we saw the results afterwards. Yes, I agree. No, but I say right or wrong. I do not interfere. I'm not an Ukrainian myself. I have much sympathy towards Ukraine, especially now. But the fact is that Maidan events were a coup d'état against maybe a very bad president, but still an elected, rightfully elected president.